Hello there, my Twilight souls. Tonight, we journey through the complete timeline of the Olympic Coven. 7 vampires spanning centuries who chose compassion over cruelty and created family from fragments of broken lives that fate had shattered beyond what mortal existence could repair. From 1640s London to 21st century Forks, these 7 immortals built something unprecedented. A family bound by the radical choice to preserve human life rather than destroy it. I pour so much into these videos, and there are days where I question myself. But then I read one of your lovely comments and it keeps me going. I haven't reached my goal of 1,000 subscribers yet, but I'm still fighting for it. If you want to support a small creator who truly cares about what she makes, it would mean the world if you subscribed. Thank you. Now, let the story of the Cullens carry you gently into rest. Carlisle Cullen was born in the 1640s in London, England, during the final years of the English Civil War, when the nation was tearing itself apart over questions of religious authority and political power, and when extremism flourished in the chaos that accompanies social breakdown and institutional collapse. His father was Anglican pastor, whose reputation rested on his zealous pursuit of evil in all its supposed forms. The older Cullen leading raids against Catholics and against Protestants of different denominations, and against anyone whose beliefs or whose practices deviated from his rigid interpretation of Christian doctrine. The father was particularly obsessed with rooting out supernatural evil. His conviction that witches and vampires and werewolves walked among humanity, driving him to organize hunting parties that searched London's darker corners for evidence of demonic activity that he believed threatened England's spiritual purity and England's survival as Christian nation. Carlisle's childhood was shaped by his father's fanaticism and by the constant atmosphere of suspicion and violence that characterized their household and their community. He witnessed burnings and hangings of supposed witches, most of whom were simply women, whose behavior or whose knowledge made them targets for communities looking for scapegoats for plague or for crop failure, or for any misfortune that required explanation beyond random chance or human error. His father justified the violence through scripture and through theological arguments that portrayed mercy as weakness and portrayed doubt as sin. His teachings creating in young Carlisle both fear of supernatural evil and deep discomfort with the methods used to combat that evil when innocent people died alongside whatever actual threats might have existed in the shadows. The father's health declined in the 1660s when Carlisle was approaching adulthood. The older man's body failing under the strain of years spent in damp cellars and cold churches and dangerous pursuits that had weathered him prematurely and had left him unable to continue the physical work of hunting monsters through London streets and sewers. Carlisle inherited his father's position and inherited his father's followers, despite his private reservations about their methods and their certainty, his intelligence and his education, making him effective leader, even as his conscience troubled him when raids produced no evidence of supernatural activity and produced only traumatized humans whose lives were destroyed by false accusations. He tried to be more careful than his father had been, and tried to require actual evidence before condemning anyone. His reforms making him popular with some community members, while others whispered that his mercy indicated weakness or indicated possible corruption by the very forces he was supposed to be eliminating. The night that changed everything came during raid in the 1660s when Carlyle was 23 years old and was leading group of men through London's Dock District, following reports of murders that bore marks suggesting supernatural predator rather than human killer. The victims had been drained of blood and had been left in poses suggesting ritual or suggesting contempt, the injuries unlike anything that knife or club could produce, and the scenes disturbing enough that even hardened men who had seen plague victims and war casualties found themselves unsettled by what they witnessed. Carlyle's group tracked the killer to sewer entrance near the Thames, the hunters descending into darkness with torches and with weapons that would prove useless against what they encountered in the tunnels beneath London streets. The vampire attacked from the shadows with speed that human eyes could barely track, the creature moving through Carlyle's group and killing 3 men in seconds before the survivors could react or could flee. Carlyle saw the thing clearly. In the torchlight, beautiful beyond human norm despite being covered in blood and sewage, moving with grace that defied the cramped space and the uncertain footing, eyes reflecting light like animals' eyes as it fed on the 4th victim, while the remaining hunters ran in terror toward the surface. Carlyle tried to follow his fleeing companions, but the vampire caught him from behind, teeth sinking into his shoulder as venom entered his bloodstream alongside the pain that felt like fire spreading from the wound through his veins and toward his heart. The creature released him after the bite, apparently satisfied with having neutralized the threat, or perhaps disturbed by approaching footsteps as more hunters descended to investigate the screaming. Carlyle managed to crawl away from the carnage and managed to hide himself inside tunnel that the searchers did not thoroughly explore, his consciousness fading as the venom worked through his system and as the 3 days of transformation began in the darkness beneath London where no one would hear his screams or would find his body before the change completed. The burning was absolute and was all-consuming, every cell in his body being rewritten by venom that killed his human biology and replaced it with vampire structure that would sustain him indefinitely without requiring food or air or sleep that human existence demanded. He emerged from transformation in the tunnel 3 days later, with senses that were impossibly sharp and with thirst that was immediate and was overwhelming. The smell of blood from the bodies still lying where the vampire had left them, creating hunger that felt biological and felt imperative in ways that transcended choice or transcended will, when every instinct screamed to feed and to satisfy the burning in his throat that venom had created. But the horror of what he had become crashed over him before he could act on the thirst. His deeply held religious beliefs and his fundamental identity as protector of humanity, rather than as predator warring with his new nature and creating internal conflict that saved the corpses from further desecration and saved Carlyle from becoming the monster he had spent his life hunting, He fled the sewers and fled London, his vampire speed allowing him to move through darkness and to reach countryside before dawn, would reveal his nature through skin that would sparkle rather than burn in sunlight, as legends suggested vampires did. The weeks that followed were hell of different kind than transformation had been. His attempts to destroy himself through every method he could devise failing, because vampire bodies could not be killed through drowning, or through starvation, or through falls, or through any conventional means that would kill human. He tried exposing himself to sunlight, hoping the legends were true and the sun would burn him to ash, but the light only made his skin glitter with diamond-like quality that marked him as obviously inhuman, without causing any actual damage or any pain, beyond the psychological torment of discovering that even suicide was impossible when a mortal body refused to die. The despair was absolute during those early weeks, when he could not end his existence and could not return to human life and could not imagine continuing as vampire when vampire existence required killing humans for food and required becoming the evil he had dedicated his life to opposing. He hid himself in forests and in caves, avoiding all human contact while testing the limits of his condition, and while searching for any possibility of redemption or any possibility of living according to Christian principles, when his very nature seemed designed to make righteousness impossible for a creature whose survival depended on human death. The turning point came through accident rather than through plan. His weakened state after weeks without feeding making him clumsy enough that he startled a herd of deer in the forest where he was, hiding from humanity and from himself. One deer fell during the panicked flight, its leg breaking against rock as the animal tried to escape the predator whose scent had triggered their flight instinct. Carlyle approached the injured animal intending nothing beyond ending its suffering, but the smell of its blood and the sound of its rapid heartbeat triggered the thirst that he had been suppressing through sheer willpower and through religious conviction that was wearing thin under the biological pressure of extended starvation. He fed from the deer and discovered that animal blood could satisfy the thirst even if it did not satisfy it completely, or did not satisfy it in the same way that human blood would have satisfied it, based on the memories of smell and of sound that his transformation had left him with from the victims in the sewer. The relief was immediate and was profound, not simply from ending the physical torment of thirst, but from discovering that vampire existence did not necessarily require human death, and did not necessarily require him to become monster, despite the monster's body he now inhabited. The animal blood was less appealing and was less nutritious, requiring him to feed more frequently than human blood would require. But the compromise was acceptable when the alternative was damnation, or was becoming the thing he most despised. The following decades were spent perfecting his control and perfecting his understanding of what vampire existence could be if vampire chose to exercise restraint and chose to value human life despite the ease with which that life could be taken. He tested his limits carefully, approaching human settlements from downwind to gauge his reaction to human scent and to build tolerance that would allow him to exist among humans without constantly fighting the urge to feed. The control developed gradually through practice and through absolute commitment to his principles. Each successful interaction with humans without killing them, building his confidence and building his ability to maintain the discipline that vegetarian lifestyle required, when every instinct pushed him toward easier prey and toward more satisfying blood that humans would provide. Carlyle's wanderings took him across Europe during the 1700s as he sought education and sought purpose beyond mere survival, his immortality allowing him to study at universities and to learn from masters in various fields without concern for the limited time that mortal students possessed. He studied medicine and studied philosophy and studied languages, his vampire memory allowing him to absorb and to retain information with perfect recall that made him exceptional student and made him valuable colleague to professors who never suspected what he was beneath the human performance he had learned to execute flawlessly. The academic pursuits gave him purpose and gave him structure. The goals of mastering new subjects and of contributing to human knowledge replacing the religious mission he had lost when transformation had separated him from the church and from the community that had defined his human existence. The time in Italy during the early 1700s brought him to Volterra and brought him into contact with the Volturi, the three ancient vampires who ruled vampire civilization and who enforced the laws that kept vampire existence secret from human awareness. Aro and Marcus and Caius were fascinated by Carlyle's vegetarian lifestyle and by his choice to live among humans as doctor rather than to live among vampires as predator. Their interest in his unusual approach to immortality leading them to invite him to stay in Volterra and to join their guard, or to at least remain as curiosity and as guest in their household. Carlyle spent several decades with the Volturi observing their approach to vampire existence and observing the casual cruelty that characterized their feeding habits and their treatment of humans as renewable resource rather than as beings with inherent value. The Volturi's court was beautiful and was terrible. The art and the culture and the refinement existing alongside the feeding chambers where humans were brought as meals and were consumed as entertainment. When the ancient vampires hosted gatherings or hosted visitors from other covens who came to pay tribute or to seek favor. Carlyle witnessed countless deaths during his time in Volterra. His presence tolerated because Aro found his resistance to human blood fascinating, and because Marcus appreciated having someone whose emotional state was not the crushing ennui that characterized most ancient vampires who had exhausted the novelty of existence centuries earlier. Caius remained suspicious of Carlyle's motives and remained convinced that the vegetarian lifestyle was performance or was temporary phase that would end when Carlyle's willpower finally broke under the constant temptation of human blood. The departure from Volterra came when Carlyle could no longer reconcile his continued presence with his values, his observation of the Volturi's practices confirming that he could never accept their approach to immortality and could never participate in vampire civilization if participation required treating humans as food rather than as the beings whose lives he had dedicated himself to preserving. Aro was disappointed but not surprised by Carlyle's decision to leave. The ancient vampire's respect for Carlyle's commitment to his principles, making him willing to part as friends rather than as enemies, despite Caius's suggestion that allowing such unusual vampire to wander freely risked exposing their existence or risk creating problems if Carlyle's influence convinced other vampires to adopt vegetarian lifestyle that might undermine traditional vampire culture. The centuries that followed Volterra were characterized by continued movement and by continued loneliness, Carlyle's existence as solitary vampire becoming routine that was sustainable but was not fulfilling when immortality stretched infinitely ahead without companion or without family, to share the experiences and to create meaning beyond individual survival. He worked as doctor in various cities across Europe and eventually in America, his medical knowledge growing with each decade and his ability to help humans improving as scientific understanding advanced and as treatments became more effective than bloodletting and prayer had been during his early centuries. The work was satisfying because it allowed him to save lives and to use his immortality for good, rather than for destruction. But the satisfaction was limited by the constant need for secrecy and by the isolation that came from never being able to form lasting friendships or lasting professional relationships, when his unchanging appearance required regular relocation and required abandoning whatever connections he had built. The ache for family and for companionship intensified rather than faded as centuries passed, each decade of solitude making the desire for someone who understood him and who shared his values more powerful and more painful, when vampire nature made such companionship seem impossible to achieve. The other vampires he encountered during his travels were uniformly traditional in their feeding habits and uniformly dismissive of his vegetarian lifestyle, their mockery and their contempt making clear that he was aberration and was failure in their eyes rather than being pioneer or being example of what vampire could choose to be. The loneliness was absolute and was crushing. The weight of centuries without meaningful connection, creating despair that even his faith and his purpose could not fully alleviate, when immortal existence without love or without family felt like punishment rather than gift. The philosophy he developed over those centuries of solitude became the foundation for everything that would follow. His conviction that vampires could choose goodness and could choose to preserve life rather than to destroy it, creating framework for the family he would eventually build. He believed that transformation did not eliminate moral responsibility and did not eliminate capacity for love or for compassion. His own experience proving that vampire nature could be controlled and could be directed toward purposes beyond mere survival or mere satisfaction of thirst. The choice to live according to principles rather than according to instinct required constant vigilance and required strength that most vampires apparently lacked or apparently refused to develop. But the possibility existed for those willing to commit to the discipline and to the sacrifice that vegetarian lifestyle demanded. By the early 1900s, Carlyle had lived for nearly 3 centuries without companion and without family. His existence rich in knowledge and in experience, but empty in the ways that mattered most, when immortality without love felt less like blessing and more like exile from everything that gave life meaning beyond mere continuation. Edward Anthony Mason was born on the 20th of June in 1901 in Chicago, Illinois. During the first year of the 20th century, when America was entering the modern age, and when Chicago was one of the nation's great cities, whose growth and whose prosperity seemed limitless, despite the underlying problems that industrialization and immigration were creating beneath the surface appearance of progress and opportunity. His parents were Edward Mason Sr. and Elizabeth Mason, upper middle class couple whose comfortable life came from the father's success in business and whose social position was respectable, though not elite in city, where old money families looked down on newer fortunes and where social hierarchies were carefully maintained through clubs and through marriages that kept wealth concentrated within established circles. Edward was only child born to parents who doted on him and who invested heavily in his education and in his cultural development, their resources allowing them to provide piano lessons and language tutoring and all the advantages that wealthy families could purchase for their children during an era when education was becoming increasingly important for maintaining social position across generations. He was intelligent and was musically talented, his piano playing exceptional for a child his age, and his academic performance suggesting he would attend prestigious university and would enter profession befitting his family status and his own abilities. His relationship with his mother Elizabeth was particularly close, her affection genuine, and her pride in his accomplishments evident in how she spoke about him to friends and to relatives who visited their comfortable home on Chicago's North Side. The Great War that began in Europe in 1914 cast shadow over American life. Even before United States entered the conflict in 1917, the reports of trench warfare and mechanized death troubling the optimism that had characterized the early century, and making young men like Edward aware that their futures might include military service and might include experiences far removed from the peaceful prosperity their parents' generation had enjoyed. Edward was too young for the initial draft calls, but the possibility of eventually serving hung over his teenage years as the war continued year after year with casualty lists that shocked Americans unused to warfare on European scale and unused to thinking about their sons dying in foreign fields for causes that seemed distant from their daily concerns. The war ended in November of 1918. But the peace came too late to save Edward's family from the catastrophe that was already spreading through Chicago and through cities worldwide as the Spanish influenza pandemic killed millions in a matter of months and overwhelmed medical systems that had no treatment and had no understanding of the virus that was destroying healthy young adults at rates that exceeded the war's death toll. The influenza hit Chicago hard in September of 1918. The crowded conditions and the public gatherings spreading the virus rapidly through population that had no immunity and had no protection against infection that could kill within days or within hours of first symptoms appearing. Edward Sr. fell ill first in mid-September, his robust health failing rapidly as the virus attacked his lungs and created the pneumonia and the complications that killed so many victims before doctors could do anything beyond making them comfortable and hoping their bodies would fight off the infection. He died within 3 days of developing fever, his death shocking the family and shocking the community where he had been well known and well-respected businessman whose future had seemed secure until virus proved that wealth and status provided no protection against microscopic enemy that killed without regard for social position or economic resources. Elizabeth and Edward both contracted the virus within days of the father's death. Their exposure to his illness during his final days almost guaranteeing their infection when the disease was most contagious during the period before death, and when family members caring for sick relatives became victims themselves through the close contact that nursing required. Carlisle Cullen was working night shift at Chicago Hospital during the height of the pandemic. His unusual request for nocturnal hours accepted by administrators desperate for any medical help they could find when doctors and nurses were themselves falling ill, and when the death toll was creating staffing crisis that left patients lying in hallways and dying without adequate care. His vampire nature allowed him to work continuously without rest, and allowed him to resist the infection that was killing his colleagues, his medical knowledge, and his compassion, making him invaluable during crisis, even though he could do little to save patients when medicine had no effective treatments for viral infection, and when supportive care was all that could be offered to the dying. Elizabeth Mason recognized that Carlyle was different during her final days of consciousness, her maternal instinct, or perhaps her delirium, allowing her to see past his human performance and to perceive something unusual about the young doctor who worked through the nights and who never seemed to tire or to age despite the crippling conditions that were wearing down the other medical staff. She could see that her son was dying alongside her, his youth providing no protection against virus that seemed to prefer healthy young adults over the elderly or the very young, who had better survival rates for reasons that medical science could not explain. Her final request to Carlyle was strange and was specific, her eyes meeting his as she begged him to save her son in ways that normal doctors could not save him, and to do whatever was necessary to give Edward the life that the virus was stealing from him, even if that life would be different from the life she had imagined for her only child. Carlyle understood what she was asking, despite her words being veiled and being unclear to anyone who did not know what he was and what he could offer. Her recognition of his true nature making her plea for transformation clear, even though she could not have fully understood what vampire existence would mean for Edward, or what costs immortality would impose on the son she loved more than she loved her own life. The decision to transform Edward came from Elizabeth's dying wish, combined with Carlyle's own loneliness and his own longing for companion, who could share his existence and could perhaps adopt his vegetarian lifestyle if Carlyle could teach him control before the thirst became overwhelming and before the new vampire killed humans and became monster rather than becoming family. He waited until Elizabeth died before taking Edward from the hospital to the place he had prepared for transformation that would require 3 days of privacy and would require space where Edward's screams would not be heard by neighbors or by passers-by, who might investigate the sounds and might discover what Carlyle was doing. The bite and the venom injection happened quickly. Carlyle's experience with his own transformation, allowing him to place the bites efficiently and to ensure the venom would spread rapidly through Edward's dying system and would reach his heart before the influenza could complete its work of shutting down his organs and ending his life at 17 years old, before he had experienced adulthood or had experienced any of the future his mother had hoped he would have. The 3 days of Edward's transformation were agonizing for both of them. Edward's screams, constant and terrible, while Carlyle waited and worried that he had made wrong decision and had condemned innocent boy to existence he had not chosen and had not wanted, when his only crime was contracting virus that was killing millions through no fault of their own. But the alternative had been watching Edward die and had been allowing Elizabeth's plea to go unanswered, and Carlyle's centuries of loneliness made the possibility of companion and the possibility of family too powerful to resist, even when transforming without full consent violated principles Carlyle had held sacred during his solitary centuries. Edward emerged from transformation on the 3rd day with vampire senses and vampire strength, and with the immediate discovery of gift that made his existence both more bearable and more torturous than normal vampire existence would have been. He could hear thoughts of everyone around him, the mental voices as clear as spoken words and as impossible to ignore as sounds would be. Impossible to ignore when vampire hearing was already sensitive enough to detect heartbeats and breathing from significant distances. Carlyle's thoughts were the first he heard. The relief and the joy and the guilt, all present simultaneously in the mind of the vampire who had saved him and had condemned him to immortality in single act that was both mercy and violation. The explanation of what had happened and what Edward had become came from Carlyle's patient teaching and from Edward's own exploration of his new abilities as he tested his strength and his speed and discovered that his body was indestructible and was powerful beyond what human existence had allowed. Carlyle explained the vegetarian lifestyle and explained the philosophy that made it possible for vampires to choose compassion over cruelty and to choose to preserve human life rather than to destroy it for sustenance that animal blood could provide adequately, if not completely. Edward's acceptance of the vegetarian choice came partly from gratitude to Carlyle for saving his life, and partly from his own moral framework that remained intact despite transformation, and that made the idea of killing humans for food repugnant, even when the thirst suggested that human blood would be infinitely more satisfying than animal blood could ever be. The early years of Edward's vampire existence were characterized by adaptation and by learning. Carlyle's guidance helping him develop control and helping him navigate the challenges of living among humans while being predator designed to hunt them. The telepathy was a double-edged gift that allowed Edward to understand people in ways that normal vampires could not understand them, but that also meant he could never escape the constant barrage of human thoughts and human concerns that filled his mind whenever he was near population centers or near groups of people whose mental voices created noise that was overwhelming and was exhausting. He learned to filter the thoughts and to focus on specific minds when necessary, but the ability was never fully under his control and was never something he could completely shut off. When every human he encountered broadcast their consciousness directly into his awareness, whether he wanted access or not. The 1920s brought Edward's rebellion period when gratitude and when initial acceptance of vampire nature gave way to frustration and to the belief that he could exercise moral judgment about whose lives were worth preserving and whose lives were forfeit because their actions or their intentions marked them as deserving of death. The telepathy made the rationalization easy because Edward could read the thoughts of criminals and could read the thoughts of men planning rapes or planning murders or planning other acts that human justice might not prevent or might not punish adequately. He convinced himself that killing such men was righteous act rather than murder and was justice rather than feeding. When he was eliminating threats to innocent people and when his victims were themselves predators who would cause suffering if allowed to live. Carlyle knew about Edward's departure from vegetarian lifestyle through Edward's inability to hide his activities from someone he lived with and someone whose disappointment Edward could feel even without telepathy. When Carlyle's silence and Carlyle's sadness made clear that he knew what Edward was doing and disapproved without condemning or without trying to force Edward's return. The patience Carlyle showed during Edward's decade of rebellion demonstrated the depth of his love and demonstrated his faith that Edward would eventually recognize the problems with his justification and would eventually return to the family and to the lifestyle that preserved humanity, rather than destroying it selectively based on judgments that Edward had no right to make, regardless of how evil his victims' thoughts suggested they were. The years of hunting. Criminals brought Edward into contact with darkness that reading thoughts made impossible to ignore or to forget. The dying thoughts of his victims revealing their humanity and revealing their complexity even when their actions or their plans had been monstrous. He heard murderers thinking of their mothers, and heard rapists thinking of their own abuse, and heard every variation of human brokenness and human evil filtered through minds that were not simply monsters, but were damaged people whose choices had created victims, but who were themselves products of circumstances and of traumas that Edward's telepathy forced him to witness and to understand. The killing became harder rather than easier as the decade progressed, each victim's last thoughts adding weight to Edward's conscience and adding evidence that his moral calculus was flawed when every life contained complexity that simplified judgments of deserving and undeserving could not accommodate. The return to Carlisle came in 1931, after a decade of wandering and after a decade of killing men, whose deaths Edward could no longer justify to himself, even when their thoughts revealed plans for violence that would hurt innocent people. The shame he felt was profound and was crushing. His recognition that he had become the monster Carlyle had worked centuries to avoid becoming, making Edward desperate for forgiveness and desperate for guidance that would help him find path back to the principles he had abandoned in his arrogance and in his belief that telepathy gave him wisdom that justified playing judge and executioner to humans whose lives were not his, to take regardless of how evil their intentions seemed. Carlyle's forgiveness was immediate and was complete, his joy at Edward's return outweighing any disappointment about the decade of rebellion and any concern about the lives Edward had taken during his time away from the family. The acceptance without judgment and the love without conditions demonstrated what Edward had lost during his years of solitude and what he had thrown away when he had convinced himself that his gift made him superior to Carlyle's moral framework, rather than making him more responsible for using his abilities in service of compassion rather than in service of his own rationalized violence. The reunion marked the beginning of Edward's permanent commitment to vegetarian lifestyle and his permanent commitment to the family that Carlyle was building through transformation and through the philosophical foundation that made their existence bearable when immortality without purpose would have been torture rather than gift. The following decades brought stability and brought the melancholy that would characterize Edward's personality across the century that followed his return, his brooding nature solidifying as he watched Carlyle's contentment and as he searched for meaning through music and through literature and through philosophy that might explain or might justify immortal existence that felt incomplete when everyone around him eventually paired off and found romantic love while Edward remained alone. The telepathy that had seemed like gift became curse when it convinced him that no one would ever want him as partner, when partnership would mean having someone reading every thought and knowing every private feeling and every moment of vulnerability that normal relationships allowed people to keep hidden behind polite social performance. The loneliness was profound and was persistent, Edward's isolation more complete than Carlisle's isolation had been, because Carlisle at least had hoped that companion might exist somewhere, while Edward convinced himself that his gift made him fundamentally unsuitable for romance and made him destined for eternal solitude within the family structure that provided meaning, but did not provide the intimate connection that he watched the others find across the decades that followed his return. Esme Ann Platt was born in 1895 in small town in Ohio during the final years of the 19th century, when American life was still largely rural and when women's futures were determined primarily by marriage and by the domestic roles that society expected them to fulfill regardless of their own desires or their own capabilities beyond the household sphere. Her childhood was conventional and was comfortable. Her parents, respectable middle-class people, whose expectations for their daughter included education sufficient for social graces, but not education that would prepare her for independence or for career, when marriage was understood to be the only acceptable path for young women, whose value was measured by their ability to attract suitable husbands and to create stable homes. The accident that changed her life happened in 1911, when Esme was 16 years old and was climbing a tree near her family's property, the fall breaking her leg badly enough that local doctor could not adequately treat the injury and could not set the bone properly without causing additional damage that might cripple her permanently. Her parents brought her to larger town, where visiting doctor named Carlisle Cullen was working temporarily at the hospital. His reputation as skilled physician making him the obvious choice for treating complicated fracture that required expertise beyond what country doctors possessed. Carlisle treated her injury with care and with gentleness that made impression on young Esme, whose pain was severe but whose awareness of the kind doctor remained sharp, despite the trauma and despite the medication that dulled some of the physical suffering. The connection she felt during those brief interactions was powerful and was memorable. Carlisle's unusual beauty and his unusual compassion creating an impression that stayed with her across the years that followed, when her life moved forward according to expectations and according to the path that her parents had planned for her future. She thought about him occasionally during her late teenage years, the memory of his kindness and his careful attention, providing contrast to the rougher treatment she received from other men, whose interest in her was less gentle and less genuine, when their attention focused on her appearance or on her suitability as wife, rather than on her well-being or on her personhood, beyond the role she would play in their lives. The pressure to marry intensified as Esme approached her early 20s, her parents growing anxious that she would become spinster if she did not accept one of the proposals she received from local men, whose credentials were acceptable, even if their characters were questionable, or even if Esme felt no affection for them beyond polite friendship. Charles Evanson was persistent suitor, whose family owned land adjacent to her parents' property, and whose financial position made him attractive match in her parents' eyes, despite Esme's private reservations about his temperament, and despite the rumors she had heard about his treatment of animals and his treatment of servants who worked for his family. The engagement came in 1917, when Esme was 22 years old, and when her parents' insistence finally wore down her resistance and convinced her that marriage to Charles was preferable to remaining dependent on her family indefinitely, when society offered no acceptable alternatives for unmarried women. The marriage was disaster from the beginning, Charles's true nature revealing itself once the wedding had secured his possession of Esme and had given him legal authority over her that 19th century marriage laws granted to husbands regardless of how they exercised that authority. He was violent and was controlling, his physical abuse beginning during their honeymoon and continuing throughout their marriage, as Esme learned that her husband viewed her as property rather than as partner, and viewed marriage as license to treat her however his moods dictated without concern for her suffering or for her safety. She endured the abuse in silence because divorce was scandalous, and because returning to her parents would shame them, and would mark her as failure when wives were expected to manage their households and to manage their husbands through submission and through the domestic skills that supposedly made men content and made violence unnecessary. The pregnancy that began in 1920 brought brief hope into Esme's miserable existence, the baby representing possibility of love and representing purpose beyond mere survival, when motherhood might provide meaning that marriage had failed to provide. Charles's reaction to the pregnancy was indifferent at best and hostile at worst, his violence not decreasing despite her condition, and his attention focused on his own concerns rather than on preparing for fatherhood or on supporting his pregnant wife through the physical and emotional challenges that pregnancy created. Esme dreamed about her baby and dreamed about the future when she would have someone to love unconditionally and someone who would love her in return, without the cruelty and without the violence that characterized every interaction with her husband. The escape came in 1921 when Esme could no longer endure Charles's abuse and could no longer convince herself that staying was protecting her unborn child, when the violence was endangering both of them, and when remaining meant risking her life and risking the baby's life for the sake of maintaining appearances that no longer seemed worth preserving. She fled to Wisconsin, where distant relatives lived and where Charles would have difficulty finding her. The journey dangerous for a pregnant woman traveling alone, but less dangerous than remaining in a household where her husband's violence was escalating and where his temper was becoming more unpredictable as her pregnancy progressed and as her condition made her more vulnerable to his attacks. The baby was born in small Wisconsin town in March of 1921. The delivery attended by midwife rather than by doctor when Esme's limited resources could not afford hospital care and when her isolation made medical attention difficult to access. The baby boy was perfect and was beautiful, his arrival bringing joy that Esme had not felt since childhood, and bringing hope that her suffering had purpose and had meaning when this small life depended on her, and when his existence validated every sacrifice she had made to escape Charles and to create safe space for her son to grow. She held him and loved him and made plans for their future together. The possibilities seeming limitless despite her poverty and despite her lack of support, when maternal love felt sufficient to overcome any obstacle and to create the life she wanted for both of them. The baby died 3 days after birth from complications that the midwife could not treat and could not prevent, his tiny body failing despite Esme's desperate attempts to save him, and despite her prayers that whatever God existed would spare this innocent life and would take her instead if death was required. The loss was absolute and was devastating. Every hope and every plan destroyed in the moments when his breathing stopped and when his small heart ceased beating And when Esme's reason for living disappeared along with the child, who had been her only source of joy in existence, that had been characterized by suffering and by disappointment since her marriage had begun, the despair that followed her son's death was complete and was overwhelming. Esme's will to live evaporating when the future she had imagined was impossible, and when continuing meant enduring grief that felt unbearable, when every breath reminded her of what she had lost, and when every moment was torture that served no purpose and achieved nothing beyond prolonging suffering that had no end and no relief. The cliff near the town offered escape that other methods would not provide, the height sufficient that the fall would kill her quickly and would end the pain that living required, when life held nothing but memories of the baby she had loved for 3 days and had lost forever. She jumped on spring evening when the sun was setting, and when the world seemed beautiful in ways that mocked her grief and mocked her suffering, the fall bringing the impact and the injuries that should have killed her immediately, but that left her alive enough that her heart continued beating faintly, even after her body had been broken beyond what human medicine could repair. The authorities found her and brought her to morgue, assuming she was dead or assuming she would die before reaching hospital when her injuries were clearly fatal, and when allocating medical resources to obviously dying woman seemed wasteful when those resources could help patients with actual chances of survival. Carlisle Cullen was working at the hospital when Esme's body arrived at the morgue, his vampire hearing detecting the faint heartbeat that human ears could not hear, and his recognition of her face from 10 years earlier making him pause and making him reconsider what he was about to do. He remembered the 16-year-old girl with the broken leg, and remembered her smile despite her pain, and remembered thinking that she had unusual warmth and unusual capacity for joy that most humans did not possess, in ways that vampire senses could detect. The recognition combined with the sound of her dying heart, and with the understanding that she had chosen death rather than chosen life, created decision point that would determine both their futures when transformation was possible. But consent was impossible to obtain from unconscious woman, whose suicide attempt suggested she might not want the life that vampire existence would provide. The decision to transform her came from compassion and from loneliness, and from the recognition that letting her die meant losing someone who had made impression across decade, and meant allowing her choice to stand when that choice had been made from despair rather than from genuine desire for death. He took her from the morgue to the place he had prepared and bit her in the necessary locations to ensure venom would spread through her dying system before her injuries could complete their work of ending her life at 26 years old, after existence that had been characterized by suffering and by loss, that had driven her to seek escape through death, that Carlisle was preventing through transformation she had not requested and had not wanted. The 3 days of transformation brought Esme from death's edge to vampire existence, the burning consuming her broken body and rebuilding it into indestructible form that would never age and would never die, and would never allow her the escape that the cliff jump had been meant to provide. The awakening brought confusion and brought disorientation as vampire senses overwhelmed her consciousness, and as the realization of what she had become replaced the expectation of death with a recognition of immortality that stretched infinitely ahead. without end and without the oblivion she had sought when living, had become unbearable. Carlyle's face was the first thing she saw clearly when vampire vision focused, his features recognizing from decade earlier, and his presence bringing memories of kindness and bringing memories of the doctor who had treated her broken leg with gentleness that had stayed with her across the years. The explanation of what had happened and what she had become came gently from Carlyle, whose guilt about transforming her without consent was evident in his expression and in his careful words that sought to help her understand, while acknowledging that he had taken choice from her, just as suicide attempt had been about reclaiming choice from life that had stolen her agency through marriage and through loss. The love that developed between them was neither instant nor simple. Esme's gratitude for Carlyle's presence, mixing with grief about her lost son, and mixing with adjustment to vampire nature that felt alien and felt wrong when she had wanted death and had received immortality instead. But Carlyle's patient care and Carlyle's evident loneliness and Carlyle's compassion gradually won her affection and gradually convinced her that vampire existence might offer possibilities that human existence had denied her when marriage had been trapped and when motherhood had been brief joy followed by devastating loss. The capacity for love that had characterized her human nature intensified through transformation, her passionate warmth becoming vampire gift that allowed her to love deeply and completely in ways that brought life to the household and brought joy to Carlyle, whose centuries of solitude ended through partnership with woman whose heart was large enough to encompass not just husband, but the family they would build together. The marriage between Carlyle and Esme formalized bond that had developed during months following her transformation. Their union creating foundation for family structure that would grow across the decades as other broken souls found refuge in the household where compassion mattered more than power and where love mattered more than strength. Rosalie Lillian Hale was born on the 11th of September in 1915 in Rochester, New York, during the second year of the Great War that was consuming Europe and that would eventually draw America into conflict, that would reshape the world order and would end the optimism that had characterized the early 20th century before mechanized warfare had demonstrated humanity's capacity for industrialized destruction. Her parents were successful banker and his socially ambitious wife, who had married for mutual advantage rather than for love, but who had created comfortable life together through their complementary skills in accumulating wealth and in displaying that wealth through the elaborate social performances that characterized upper-class existence in medium-sized American cities, where old money families competed for status and where new money families sought acceptance into established hierarchies. Rosalie's beauty was apparent from infancy in ways that shaped how everyone around her responded to her existence. Her parents' friends commenting constantly on the baby's perfect features and the baby's unusual loveliness that exceeded normal infant cuteness and that suggested she would grow into remarkable beauty if she maintained the promise that her early appearance displayed. Her mother recognized immediately that Rosalie's appearance was a valuable asset that could be cultivated and could be leveraged for social advancement, the kind of beauty that could attract wealthy suitor and could elevate the family's position through advantageous marriage that would connect them to families with older money and with more established social credentials than banking wealth alone could provide. Her father was proud of having produced such a beautiful daughter, but was less calculating about the strategic implications. His affection more genuine, even though he also recognized that beautiful daughters were currency in social exchanges that governed upper-class marriage markets, where families negotiated alliances through their children's unions. Rosalie's childhood was characterized by privilege and by careful grooming for the role she would eventually play as ornament and as valuable commodity in marriage negotiations that her parents were already planning before she had learned to read or to write. She had the finest clothes that money could buy, her mother dressing her like doll for social events and for photographs that documented the family's prosperity and that displayed Rosalie as the crown jewel of their success. She attended the best private schools where daughters of Rochester's elite families learned the skills they would need to manage wealthy households and to perform the social duties that upper-class wives were expected to fulfill through hosting parties and through participating in charitable organizations that allowed rich women to feel purposeful while maintaining their positions at the top of local hierarchies. The Great Depression that began in 1929, when Rosalie was 14 years old, devastated most American families and destroyed the financial security that millions of people had believed was permanent and was guaranteed by the endless prosperity that had characterized the 1920s before the stock market collapse, had revealed how fragile the economic system actually was beneath its surface. Appearance of stability. Rosalie's family was among the relatively few who maintained their wealth through the Depression years. Her father's conservative banking practices and his careful investments having protected their fortune from the worst of the economic catastrophe that was driving other families into poverty and into desperation. Their continued prosperity during years when most people were struggling to survive made their wealth more visible and made their social position more secure, because scarcity had eliminated much of the competition and had reduced the number of families who could afford the kind of lifestyle that the Hales continued to enjoy, while breadlines formed in other neighborhoods and while unemployment reached levels that threatened social stability. Rosalie's beauty matured along with her body as she moved through adolescence, her features developing into the kind of extraordinary loveliness that made people stop and stare when she walked past them on the street or when she entered rooms where gatherings were happening. She was not simply pretty in the way that many young girls were pretty, but was beautiful in ways that seemed almost unreal. Her face possessing the kind of symmetry and the kind of perfection that artists tried to capture in paintings and in sculptures, but that rarely existed in actual human beings, whose features typically contained some asymmetry or some flaw that prevented them from achieving the ideal proportions that classical beauty required. Her golden hair caught light in ways that made it seem luminous. Her violet blue eyes were striking against her fair skin. Her features were delicate, but were perfectly balanced, and her figure developed into the kind of proportions that fashion magazines featured and that men found irresistible regardless of their age or their social position. The best friend Vera represented everything Rosalie secretly wanted, despite outward appearance of satisfaction with her privileged existence and despite the social success that her beauty guaranteed. Vera had married for love rather than for money. Her husband was simple carpenter rather than banker or lawyer or businessman. but their humble home was filled with genuine warmth and genuine affection that Rosalie had never witnessed in her own parents' marriage, or in the marriages of other wealthy couples, whose unions were business arrangements wrapped in romantic pretense. Vera's baby son was beautiful to Rosalie in ways that jewels and clothes had never been beautiful. The infant representing future and representing creation, and representing the kind of meaning that Rosalie sensed was missing from her own elaborate but ultimately empty existence. The suitors who pursued Rosalie throughout her teenage years were numerous and were persistent. Their interest in her based almost entirely on her appearance and on the status that being seen with the most beautiful girl in Rochester would provide to whichever man succeeded in winning her attention. They sent flowers and sent gifts and sent letters filled with poetry and with declarations of devotion that felt hollow because the devotion was to image rather than to person. Their love directed at the beautiful face and the beautiful body, rather than at the actual human being who existed behind the appearance that they worshipped. She accepted their attention as her due, but found little satisfaction in their praise because she recognized that none of them actually knew her, or actually cared about knowing her when her appearance was sufficient to fulfill their fantasies about possessing the perfect woman, whose beauty would reflect their own success and their own status. Royce King II was oldest son and heir to the King fortune, his family representing old money in Rochester, whose wealth predated the industrial expansion that had created new fortunes during the late 1800s, and that had elevated families like Rosalie's father's family into prosperity, but not into the highest social circles where ancestry mattered as much as current wealth. Royce's pursuit of Rosalie began when she was 17 years old and when he was 24. His interest in her sparked by seeing her at social event, where her beauty had been the center of attention and where every man present had been watching her with obvious desire that Royce decided to satisfy by making her his conquest and eventually his wife. His courtship was aggressive and was possessive from the beginning, his gifts extravagant, and his public displays of attention designed to establish his claim on her and to discourage other suitors from competing for her affection. The engagement announcement came in March of 1933 when Rosalie was 17 and when Royce had finally secured her father's permission and had finally presented her with a ring that cost more than most families earned in a year. The announcement was published in all the local newspapers, the society columns describing the engagement as union of two prominent families, and describing Rosalie as the most beautiful bride-to-be that Rochester had ever seen. Her mother was triumphant, the engagement representing culmination of years of careful cultivation and representing proof that beauty could be converted into social position and into financial security. The wedding was planned for summer, the preparations already beginning before the engagement was officially announced, because her mother had been planning the event for months in anticipation of Royce's proposal that everyone had known was coming. The visit to Vera's home in early April of 1933 changed something in Rosalie's understanding of what she actually wanted versus what she was supposed to want, according to her parents' ambitions and society's expectations. Vera had recently given birth to her second child, baby boy, who was healthy and was beautiful in the way that babies are beautiful when they are wanted and are loved, without conditions or without calculations, about what advantages they might provide. Rosalie held the baby and felt longing that was physical and was powerful. The weight of the infant in her arms and the warmth of his small body against her chest, creating desire for motherhood that exceeded any desire she had ever felt for jewels or for clothes or for the social status that her upcoming marriage would provide. The walk home from Vera's house on that April evening was supposed to be a short trip through familiar streets in safe neighborhood where wealthy families lived and where crime was rare because poverty was absent. Rosalie wore her best dress and wore the engagement ring that Royce had given her, her appearance that evening particularly beautiful because she had been visiting and had wanted to show Vera the ring and had wanted to display the evidence of her successful engagement to man from one of Rochester's finest families. The spring evening was pleasant and was mild, the kind of weather that made walking enjoyable and that made Rochester's tree-lined streets seem idyllic and seem safe for a young woman to traverse alone in. Early evening hours before full darkness had fallen. The street was not empty when Rosalie turned the corner toward her parents' house. The lamplight illuminating group of well-dressed men who were laughing too loudly and who were walking with the unsteady gait that indicated they had been drinking for hours at some private club or some restaurant where wealthy young men gathered to celebrate their privileges and to enjoy the pleasures that money could purchase. She recognized Royce immediately despite the distance and despite the poor lighting, his distinctive profile and his expensive suit marking him clearly as her fiancé even before he turned and saw her walking toward him. His friends were with him, men she had met at various social functions and whose names she knew, but whose characters she had never considered beyond their social credentials and their family connections that made them acceptable companions for the king heir. The assault began with Royce's brutal kiss and escalated into violence that destroyed her body and destroyed her beauty and destroyed her future in the street 3 blocks from her parents' house, where she had been expected for dinner hours earlier. His friends participated with enthusiasm that suggested they had done this before or had wanted to do this before but had never had opportunity or had never had permission from someone with Royce's status and Royce's confidence that consequences would not follow from actions that would destroy other men, but that would barely inconvenience someone with the King family's power and the King family's connections to legal system and to social structure that protected wealthy men from accountability. Her bones broke under their blows, her ribs cracked and punctured her lungs, her face was destroyed by Royce's fists, and her internal injuries were fatal without medical intervention that would not come in time to save her human life. They left her dying in the gutter like refuse that needed to be disposed of, but that was not worth the effort of actual disposal. Royce's last words to her being apology that was not sincere, and that blamed her for walking alone and for being so beautiful that he could not control himself when he saw her. The pain was fading into numbness that spread from her extremities toward her core, the cold replacing sensation in her fingers and in her toes, and gradually moving up her limbs toward her torso, where her damaged organs were failing and were shutting down in sequence that would eventually stop her heart and would end her life on street corner where no one was passing by to find her and to help her. Carlisle Cullen found her sometime later when the night had grown fully dark and when the street was empty except for her dying body, that he almost missed seeing in the shadows where they had left her. The smell of her blood reached him before he saw her. The scent triggering thirst that he had learned to control through centuries of practice, but that still required conscious effort to resist when fresh human blood was abundant and was easily accessible. His horror at her condition was genuine and was visible in his expression when he knelt beside her and assessed her injuries with experienced medical eye that recognized immediately that she was beyond saving through conventional medicine or through any intervention that human doctor could provide. The decision to transform her was not made lightly or made quickly, despite the urgency of her condition. Carlyle's moral framework requiring him to consider whether giving her immortality without her consent was justified, even when alternative was allowing her to die in street from injuries inflicted by monsters who had destroyed her for entertainment. He recognized her from society pages and from seeing her around Rochester, her extraordinary beauty making her memorable even in city full of wealthy families and beautiful young women. The transformation happened quickly once he decided. His vampire speed, allowing him to carry her to his home and to bide her in the necessary locations before death became irreversible and before her chance at survival disappeared, along with her fading heartbeat. The 3 days of transformation were agony beyond anything Rosalie had experienced during the assault. The burning in her veins making the physical trauma seem almost pleasant by comparison, because physical pain had limits, but the fire transforming her cells apparently had no limits and had no mercy. She emerged from transformation with vampire body that was healed and was perfect but was wrong. Her beauty magnified beyond even her human beauty into something that was designed to attract human prey through supernatural loveliness that overcame human caution. The realization of what she had lost hit her with force that made her wish the transformation had failed. She would never age, never die, never have children, never experience the simple human future she had wanted more than she had wanted beauty or wanted wealth. Emmett McCarty was born in 1915 in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, in the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains, where his family had lived for generations, and where life was characterized by hard work and by close connection to the land that provided their livelihood through farming and through logging that employed most men in the region. His family was working class and was large. Emmett, being one of several siblings whose childhood was shaped by limited resources, but by abundant affection and by the kind of freedom that rural poverty sometimes allowed, when children could roam forests and could explore mountains without the supervision or the restrictions that wealthy urban families imposed on their offspring. He was tall from early adolescence and was strong beyond what most boys his age could achieve, his physical size making him a valuable worker in family enterprises and making him confident in his abilities and in his capacity to handle whatever challenges life might present. His disposition was cheerful and was optimistic from childhood. His personality characterized by humor and by playfulness that made him popular among his siblings and among his peers, who enjoyed his company and who sought him out for activities that required strength or that required someone whose presence made work feel less burdensome and made difficult tasks seem manageable through his encouragement and through his willingness to tackle the hardest parts himself. He loved physical challenges and loved testing his strength through wrestling and through competitions that pitted him against other strong young men whose abilities were impressive but were rarely equal to Emmett's combination of size and power and natural athleticism that made him a formidable opponent in any contest that required physical prowess. The outdoors was Emmett's natural environment, his comfort in forests and in mountains, reflecting generations of mountain heritage and reflecting personal affinity for wilderness that felt like home in ways that towns or cities never could, when he preferred the company of trees and animals to the company of crowds and to the noise that human settlements created. He hunted regularly to supplement his family's food supply and to contribute to household economy that depended on everyone's efforts to maintain even basic standard of living. His skill with rifle adequate, and his comfort tracking prey through difficult terrain exceptional when his knowledge of the mountains and his physical endurance allowed him to pursue game into areas where less experienced hunters would not venture. The bear attack happened in 1935 when Emmett was 20 years old and was hunting alone in the mountains during spring when black bears were emerging from hibernation and were particularly dangerous due to hunger and due to mothers protecting cubs who might be nearby even when not immediately visible. He had tracked deer into a remote area where he rarely ventured, his focus on the prey making him less attentive to his surroundings than he should have been, when bear country required constant vigilance and required awareness that humans were not apex predators in wilderness where bears ruled and where human confidence was liability rather than asset. The bear attacked from behind without warning, the massive black bear's charge covering distance before Emmett could react or could bring his rifle to bear on target that was too close and was moving too fast for accurate shot that might stop the attack before it began. The impact knocked him down and knocked the rifle from his hands, the bear's weight crushing him against the ground as claws and teeth tore into his body with force that broke bones and that opened wounds that would be fatal without immediate medical intervention that was not available in isolated wilderness miles from the nearest town or the nearest doctor who could treat injuries of this severity. The mauling continued for seconds that felt like hours, the bear's fury absolute and terrifying as it destroyed Emmett's body with efficiency that centuries of evolution had perfected for killing prey and for eliminating threats to the bear's territory or to the bear's cubs. His chest was opened by claws that ripped through muscle and that cracked ribs. His shoulders and arms were mangled by bites that crushed bone, and his legs were injured by the bear's weight and by his attempts to protect himself from attacks that came from angles he could not defend against when the bear was too strong and was too fast for injured human to escape or to fight effectively. Rosalie Hale found him dying in the mountain clearing after the bear had finished its attack and had wandered away satisfied that the threat had been eliminated or that the territory had been defended against the intruder would not return. She had been hunting alone after separating from Carlisle and Esme to track deer, whose scent had led her away from their planned route and into territory where she encountered the smell of human blood mixing with bear scent and with mountain air that carried the sounds of labored breathing from someone whose injuries were severe enough that death was approaching quickly. Her first instinct was to leave him to die because his death was natural outcome of dangerous situation and because interfering would require either calling for help she could not summon or transforming him into vampire, which she had sworn never to do, because she would not condemn anyone else to the existence she hated. but something about his face stopped her from leaving. The innocence in his expression and the youth in his features reminding her of futures that had been stolen when her own life had been destroyed, and reminding her of all the possibilities that death would eliminate if she allowed this young man to die in the mountains, where his body would be consumed by scavengers and would be forgotten, except by family, who would search unsuccessfully for son, who never returned from hunting trip. He was dying quickly from blood loss and from the massive trauma the bear had inflicted, his consciousness fading as she stood over him, trying to decide whether mercy meant letting him die human, or whether mercy meant saving his life, even if saving meant transforming him into a creature he had not chosen to become. The decision happened in an instant when his eyes opened and looked at her with confusion and with something that might have been hope. His hand reaching toward her in gesture that suggested he trusted her to help him, even though he had no reason to trust a beautiful girl appearing in wilderness where no one should be, and where his fading consciousness might be creating hallucination rather than perceiving actual person. She could not let him die after that moment of connection. Her choice, made before conscious thought, could intervene, or could remind her of all the reasons why transforming him was wrong when transformation had been wrong for her, and when condemning someone to immortality was cruelty rather than kindness, regardless of how the alternative looked. She carried him over 100 miles to Carlisle without stopping and without slowing, despite his weight and despite the difficulty of maintaining speed, while holding his dying body carefully enough to avoid inflicting additional injuries that might kill him before venom could take hold and could begin the transformation that would save his life at cost of his humanity. The journey took hours of constant running through forests and through mountains, her vampire endurance making the distance manageable even when carrying burden that would have been impossible for human to transport even short distance. She begged Carlisle to transform Emmett, despite knowing the pain that transformation would cause, and despite knowing that she was condemning him to immortal existence he had not requested, her justification being that he was dying anyway, and that vampire existence was better than death, even if vampire existence was worse than human life. Carlisle agreed to perform the transformation after examining Emmett's injuries and confirming that human medicine could not save him, and that death was inevitable without supernatural intervention that would violate everything Carlisle believed about consent and about the right to choose one's fate. But that seemed justified when alternative was allowing young man to die from accident rather than from choice. The 3 days of Emmett's transformation were difficult for Rosalie, who waited nearby, and who listened to his screams, and who felt guilt about causing his suffering, even though she had also saved his life and had given him existence that would continue indefinitely, rather than ending in Tennessee mountains, where his body would have been consumed by scavengers. Emmett's awakening as vampire was remarkably different from Rosalie's own awakening. His immediate acceptance of his new nature and his enthusiasm about vampire abilities creating stark contrast with her horror and her resentment when she had first understood what Carlisle had made her. Emmett loved being vampire from the first moment of consciousness. His joy at his strength and his speed and his enhanced senses making him seem like child discovering a wonderful toy rather than like person mourning loss of humanity and loss of normal future. His attitude both charmed and irritated Rosalie, who could not understand how someone could be so happy about transformation that she considered curse and considered tragedy. But his genuine cheerfulness and his lack of bitterness gradually softened her defenses and gradually made her want to protect his innocence and preserve his happiness even when she could not share those feelings herself. His devotion to her was immediate and was absolute. His recognition that she had saved his life creating gratitude that evolved quickly into love that was uncomplicated and was genuine in ways that Rosalie had never experienced from men who had wanted her for her beauty but had never wanted her for herself. Emmett loved her completely and loved her unconditionally. His affection not dependent on her appearance or on her usefulness, but simply existing because she was Rosalie and because he had imprinted on her as his savior and as his mate during those first confused moments after transformation, when she had been the first face he saw and the first voice he heard. Their connection was instantaneous and was powerful. The bond between them forming without effort and without negotiation in ways that made their relationship feel inevitable and feel right despite the circumstances of their meeting and despite the tragedy of his transformation. Their marriage ceremonies happened multiple times across the decades as they moved to new locations and created new identities, each wedding providing opportunity to celebrate their bond and providing Rosalie with experience of being bride that her human life had promised but had never delivered. Emmett made her laugh in ways that no one else could. His humor and his playfulness breaking through her seriousness and her bitterness and reminding her that immortal existence could include joy even when it couldn't include everything she wanted. The inability to give Emmett children was an ongoing source of pain for Rosalie, who recognized that he would have been a wonderful father and that he deserved the large family he had probably imagined having during his human life before the bear attack had ended those possibilities, along with ending his mortality. Mary Alice Brandon was born in 1901 in Biloxi, Mississippi, during the first year of the 20th century, when the American South was still recovering from the Civil War, and when racial segregation and when economic inequality characterized daily life in ways that northern states had moved beyond or had at least disguised more effectively through different systems of oppression and control. Her family was middle class and was respectable, their social position secure enough that Alice's childhood should have been conventional and should have been unremarkable, except for the visions that began manifesting when she was a young child, whose glimpses of future events created confusion and created fear in parents who did not understand what was happening and who interpreted her episodes as illness or as mental instability, rather than as supernatural gift that allowed her to see decisions and to see outcomes before they occurred. The visions were uncontrolled and were unpredictable during her childhood. Flashes of future possibilities arriving without warning and without context that would help young Alice understand what she was seeing, or understand how to interpret images of events that had not yet happened and might not happen if circumstances changed or if decisions were made differently than the paths her visions showed. Her parents' response to her gift was fear and was denial, their attempts to suppress her visions or to convince her that she was imagining things, creating environments where Alice learned to hide her abilities and learned to pretend normalcy when her perception of time and of reality was fundamentally different from how other people experience the world around them. The commitment to asylum happened when Alice was a teenager in the early 1920s. Her parents' growing concern about her mental state and their growing frustration with episodes they could not explain or could not control, leading them to institutionalize their daughter in a facility that promised treatment for conditions that doctors did not understand and could not cure, when psychiatric medicine was primitive and when asylums were places where inconvenient people were stored rather than places where actual healing occurred. The asylum was a nightmare of isolation and of medical procedures that range from useless to actively harmful, electroshock therapy and other experimental treatments attempting to cure her visions by destroying her brain function and by eliminating the parts of her consciousness that produced the glimpses of future that doctors considered delusions rather than considered actual perceptions of time that operated differently than normal human temporal experience. The vampire working at the asylum was predator hunting easy prey among the patients whose disappearances would not be investigated and whose deaths would not be questioned when asylum populations were transient and when mentally ill patients were considered unreliable witnesses, whose reports of missing people or of suspicious activities would be dismissed as further evidence of their delusions. This vampire was connected to a tracker named James, whose hunting style involved stalking and tormenting victims before killing them. The asylum worker identifying potential prey and marking them for James's attention when their vulnerability and their isolation made them perfect targets for tracker, who enjoyed the hunt more than the kill. The older vampire, who also worked at the asylum, recognized what was happening and recognized that James's creator was marking Alice for death that would be preceded by torture and by terror, that James specialized in creating through his tracking abilities and through his sadistic approach to hunting that made him dangerous to humans and made him dangerous to other vampires who crossed his path or who interfered with his prey. This unnamed vampire chose to transform Alice to save her from James. His decision motivated by compassion or by recognition that her gift might be valuable, or by simple opposition to James's creator, whose activities at the asylum were creating risks that might expose vampire existence if too many patients disappeared, or if investigations revealed the truth about what was happening in the facility. The transformation happened quickly and happened secretly. Alice's dying human body replaced by vampire body before James could claim her and before his creator could deliver her to Tracker, whose reputation for cruelty was well known among vampires who avoided him and who considered him dangerous even by vampire standards, where violence and predation were normalized. The older vampire who saved her killed James's creator shortly after Alice's transformation, his destruction of the other vampire, eliminating the immediate threat and eliminating James's connection to the asylum, where his creator had been operating, and where the deaths were becoming numerous enough that human authorities might eventually investigate, despite their general indifference to asylum patients' welfare. Alice's awakening as vampire was characterized by complete memory loss, her human past erased by transformation or by trauma, or by some combination of factors that left her with no knowledge of her name or of her family, or of anything that had happened before she opened her eyes as vampire, whose only knowledge of herself came from visions of her own future that showed her who she would become even if they could not show her who she had been. The visions were clearer and were more controlled as vampire than they had been as human. Her enhanced consciousness and her vampire perception allowing her to process the images and to understand the branching possibilities that decisions created, and to see how different choices would lead to different outcomes in ways that made her gift useful, rather than making it simply confusing or frightening. The vision of Jasper came early in her vampire existence, his face and his presence appearing in glimpses of future that showed her meeting him, and showed her loving him, and showed her spending eternity with partner whose existence she could see, even though she had no idea where he was or when they would actually meet. The vision of the Cullen family followed shortly after. Images of 7 vampires living together and living peacefully, showing her the future she would eventually join, and showing her the family she would eventually belong to, even though she was currently alone and was currently wandering without purpose, beyond waiting for the visions to come true. The decades between her transformation in the early 1920s and her meeting with Jasper in 1948 were spent alone, but were not spent aimlessly. Alice's visions guiding her movements and guiding her choices as she taught herself control, and as she learned to navigate vampire existence without mentor or without family, to provide the support that most newborn vampires required to survive their dangerous early years. She learned to hunt animals through trial and error, guided by visions that showed her successful techniques and showed her avoiding mistakes that might expose her nature or might create problems with human authorities who would investigate suspicious deaths or suspicious activities, even when they did not understand that vampires were responsible. Jasper Whitlock was born in 1844 in Texas, during the years before the Civil War, when the American South was building its economy on slavery, and when the tensions between North and South were escalating toward the conflict that would tear the nation apart and would reshape American society in ways that would echo across generations. He was a young man full of idealism and full of confidence when he joined the Confederate Army at age 16, after lying about his age to enlist. His charisma and his natural leadership abilities earning him rapid promotion to major, despite his youth and despite his lack of formal military training that older officers possessed through West Point education or through years of service. The encounter with Maria happened in 1863 when Jasper was 19 years old and was helping evacuate civilians from Galveston as Union forces approached the Texas coast and threatened to capture the city and to establish foothold that would allow them to control the region. Maria was vampire-creating army of newborn vampires to fight in the Southern Vampire Wars that were raging across Mexico and across the American Southwest, as vampire covens battled for territory and for feeding rights in conflicts that human authorities never detected and human history never recorded. She was accompanied by Nettie and Lucy, 2 other vampire women whose own newborn armies were smaller than Maria's forces and whose alliance with Maria was temporary convenience rather than permanent partnership. Maria recognized Jasper's potential immediately through his charisma that would translate into ability to control newborn vampires, and through his military experience that would make him effective commander of forces that required discipline and required strategic thinking to defeat rival covens whose numbers and whose territories threatened Maria's ambitions. The transformation happened without his consent and without explanation. Maria's bite condemning him to vampire existence before he understood what was happening or what he was becoming when his human life ended, and when his new existence began in service to vampire whose goals were conquest and whose methods were violence. The awakening brought discovery of empathic gift that made Jasper simultaneously valuable and tormented. His ability to feel emotions of everyone around him, and his ability to manipulate those emotions, making him perfect commander for newborn armies, whose volatility and whose bloodlust required constant management to prevent them from turning on each other or from turning on Maria herself. He could calm violent newborns and could inspire loyalty and could create the emotional states that made training effective and made combat coordination possible when dealing with vampires whose human memories were fading and whose vampire instincts were overwhelming their capacity for rational thought or strategic planning. The decades of service to Maria from 1863 through the 1890s were characterized by constant violence and by constant creation of newborn vampires, who would serve for 1 year before being destroyed when their newborn strength faded and when they became liabilities rather than assets to Maria's military operations. Jasper felt every death through his empathic sense. The fear and the confusion and the betrayal of newborns who had trusted him and who had followed his commands radiating into his consciousness as Maria or her lieutenants destroyed them to make room for fresh recruits whose year of exceptional strength would be exploited before they too were eliminated. The guilt accumulated across decades as hundreds of vampires died under his command or died by his hand when Maria ordered him to personally destroy newborns who had become problems or who had failed to meet expectations that were impossible for confused, newly transformed vampires to understand or to achieve. His empathic gift made him feel their terror and made him feel their pain even when he was not physically present for their deaths. The emotional echoes reaching him through bonds he had formed during training and during the months of commanding them in battles against rival covens whose own newborn armies were equally disposable and equally doomed. The meeting with Peter and Charlotte happened in the 1890s when two newborns under Jasper's command fell in love and decided to escape rather than wait for inevitable destruction that awaited them when their year of service ended and when Maria would eliminate them as she had eliminated all the others who had come before. Peter had gift of instinctive knowledge about when to run and when to fight. His ability to sense danger and to sense opportunity, allowing him to recognize the precise moment when escape was possible and when Maria's attention was focused elsewhere. Charlotte was his mate and his motivation, their bond strong enough that Peter was willing to risk Maria's fury and willing to risk Jasper's potential pursuit to save her from destruction that was approaching as their year of newborn strength was ending. Jasper let them go despite his orders to prevent escapes and despite his role as enforcer of Maria's discipline. His empathic sense of their love and his empathic sense of their desperation convincing him that allowing their escape was right choice, even if it meant betraying Maria and even if it meant risking his own position. Peter returned for Jasper several years later. His gratitude for being allowed to escape combining with his recognition that Jasper was suffering and was trapped in a situation that was destroying him emotionally, even though he was physically powerful and was valuable to Maria's continued military success. The departure from Maria's service happened when Peter convinced Jasper that alternative existence was possible and that the wars and the constant killing were not inevitable aspects of vampire nature, but were choices that Maria made, and that Jasper could reject if he was willing to leave the only life he had known since transformation. The years wandering with Peter and Charlotte from the late 1890s through the 1940s brought freedom from Maria, but did not bring peace. Jasper's continued feeding on humans and his continued exposure to their fear and their suffering through his empathic gift, creating depression that intensified rather than faded as decades passed without purpose or without hope that his existence could be anything other than predation and pain. The meeting with Alice happened in 1948 at diner in Philadelphia, where Jasper had stopped while wandering aimlessly through American cities, trying to find meaning or trying to find escape from existence that felt unbearable when every feeding meant feeling victims' terror, and when empathic gift that had made him valuable to Maria made him tortured by the consequences of vampire nature that required killing to survive. Alice was waiting for him with confidence and with joy. Her greeting of, "You've kept me waiting a long time," delivered with certainty that came from visions that had shown her this moment and had shown her their future together. Her explanation of vegetarian lifestyle and her visions showing him that alternative to human blood was possible created hope for first time since his transformation. The possibility that he could exist without killing humans and without feeling their deaths through empathic connection, offering escape from the cycle of feeding and guilt that had characterized his decades of wandering. The control required for vegetarian lifestyle was harder for Jasper than for other vampires, because his empathic gift meant he felt the thirst and felt the temptation multiplied by however many vampires were nearby, their desires adding to his own desire and creating pressure that made restraint difficult and made slips more likely when surrounded by family whose collective thirst amplified his personal struggle. The 2 years between meeting Alice in 1948 and joining the Cullens in 1950 was spent learning control and was spent building their partnership. Alice's visions guiding them toward the family that would accept them and that would provide the structure and the support that Jasper needed to maintain vegetarian lifestyle that went against every instinct and every habit formed during decades of traditional vampire feeding. Her optimism balanced his darkness, and her certainty about their future provided anchor when his faith in possibility of redemption wavered under weight of guilt about his past and under difficulty of resisting temptation that never fully disappeared, even as his control improved through practice and through commitment. The arrival at the Cullen household in 1950 brought family complete to 7 members whose different origins and whose different gifts would create dynamic that persisted across decades and would create bonds that made immortality bearable when shared rather than when endured alone. The pattern of relocation that characterized the Cullen family's existence from 1950 through the early 2000s was driven by necessity rather than by choice. The unchanging nature of vampire bodies making extended residence in any single community impossible when neighbors would notice that the teenage children never aged, and when colleagues would question why Dr. Cullen looked the same after 5 years or after 10 years as he had looked when he first arrived. The moves happened every few years on average, sometimes sooner if accidents occurred, or if suspicions arose, and sometimes lasting slightly longer when circumstances allowed and when the family had found particularly suitable location, where cloud cover or where isolation reduced the risks of exposure that sunlight or that close observation would create. The cover story evolved and refined across the decades as the family learned what explanations worked best and what details created believability without creating excessive interest that might lead to deeper investigation. Carlyle was always Doctor, whose medical career necessitated relocations for new positions or for research opportunities that explain why a successful physician would leave established practice to start over in different city or different town. The children were always adopted or fostered. Their various surnames and their obvious lack of biological relationship to Carlyle and Esme, requiring explanation that adoption provided, while also explaining why the teenagers sometimes looked older than their supposed parents, whose youthful appearance was remarkable, but was not impossible for humans who aged well or who maintained themselves carefully. These relationships among the family members were presented to outsiders as sibling relationships or as cousin relationships. The romantic partnerships between Rosalie and Emmett and between Alice and Jasper explained as couples who had met through the fostering system and who had fallen in love before joining the Cullen household. Edward remained unattached and remained alone across the decades, his status as single member of the family creating occasional awkwardness when classmates or when colleagues assumed he must be interested in dating, and when their attempts to set him up with potential partners required polite refusals that sometimes offended people who could not understand why handsome young man would not be interested in the girls who were clearly interested in him. The Alaska relationship with the Denali Coven provided connection to only other vegetarian vampires the Cullens knew. Tanya and Kate and Carmen and Eleazar and Irina, having adopted the animal blood diet independently before learning about Carlisle's existence and before establishing friendship that became extended family relationship across decades of occasional visits and mutual support. The Denali sisters were older than the Cullens and were more experienced with vegetarian lifestyle, their centuries of practice providing wisdom and providing perspective that helped newer vegetarian vampires maintain discipline when temptation was strong or when circumstances made animal hunting difficult. The visits to Alaska happened several times per decade when the families could coordinate their schedules and could find opportunities to gather without attracting attention from humans who might notice large groups of unusually beautiful people congregating in isolated areas. The gatherings provided social outlet that the Cullens could not find among traditional vampires whose feeding habits made them incompatible with vegetarian philosophy, and whose mockery of the lifestyle made friendship impossible when fundamental values were opposed, and when every interaction reminded the Cullens that they were aberrations in vampire society that considered them weak or considered them foolish for denying themselves the pleasures that human blood provided. The 1950s brought adjustment to post-war American culture where conformity was valued and where traditional family structures were idealized in ways that actually helped the Cullens maintain their cover, because their appearance as prosperous family with well-behaved children fit perfectly into suburban ideal that dominated the decade. The prosperity and the optimism that characterized 1950s America made relocation easier because communities were growing and were welcoming newcomers whose arrival signaled economic vitality and signaled growth, rather than signaling problems or signaling suspicious circumstances that might warrant investigation. Edward's continued melancholy during the 1950s and 1960s was evident to family members who watched him withdraw into music and into literature and into intellectual pursuits that provided distraction but did not provide the fulfillment that romantic partnership seemed to provide for the others. He watched Carlyle and Esme's steady devotion, and watched Rosalie and Emmett's passionate marriage, and watched Alice and Jasper's profound bond, while remaining convinced that his telepathy made him unsuitable for romance, when he could not imagine anyone wanting partner who would hear every thought and who would know every private feeling that normal relationships allowed people to keep hidden. The family's response to Edward's loneliness was gentle encouragement, combined with respect for his choice to remain alone, when forcing him toward relationships he did not want would violate the autonomy that Carlyle valued, and would create resentment that might damage family cohesion. They hoped he would eventually find someone whose mind was compatible with his gift, or whose silence might intrigue him enough to overcome his resistance to romantic involvement. But decades passed without such person appearing, and without Edward showing interest in anyone beyond passing curiosity that faded quickly when telepathy revealed thoughts that disappointed him, or that confirmed his belief that deep connection was impossible. The 1970s and 1980s brought continued wandering through various American regions, the family experiencing different climates and different cultures as they moved from northeast to midwest to south to west coast, and back again in patterns that avoided repetition and avoided returning to places where they might encounter people who remembered them from previous decades. The technological changes and the social changes that characterized these decades required adjustments to their cover stories and required new skills for maintaining secrecy when photography became more common and when record keeping became more sophisticated, and when disappearing and recreating identities required more effort than simple relocation had required in earlier eras. Jasper's slow improvement with control over his thirst was encouraged by family support and was enabled by Alice's visions that warned him when situations would be too tempting and when he should avoid certain circumstances that might overwhelm his restraint and might lead to slips that would endanger humans and would endanger the family's security. His struggles were understood and were accepted without judgment, the family recognizing that his empathic gift made vegetarian lifestyle harder for him than for others, and that his past trauma and his decades of traditional feeding created obstacles that patience and practice were gradually overcoming, even when progress was slow and when setbacks occasionally occurred. Alice's visions guided the family away from dangers that her gift could detect. Her ability to see decisions and to see consequences, allowing her to steer them away from locations where Volturi might be traveling, or where other vampires might create problems, or where human situations might evolve in ways that would threaten their security or would require intervention that might expose their nature. The limitations of her gift meant she could not see everything and could not prevent all problems, but her guidance was invaluable for family whose survival depended on avoiding attention and avoiding situations that normal vampires would handle through violence, but that vegetarian vampires needed to handle through avoidance or through careful planning. The routine of settling into new community and attending high school and working at hospital became so familiar across the decades that family members could execute their roles without conscious thought. Their performances of humanity refined through repetition and through observation of how humans actually behaved in different contexts and in different time periods. Each family member's role within the household solidified through the years. Carlyle as leader and as father figure whose moral compass guided family decisions. Esme as heart and as homemaker, whose love provided emotional foundation. Edward as melancholy intellectual son, whose musical talent and whose brooding nature made him recognizable across their various relocations. Rosalie as beautiful and difficult daughter, whose bitterness about vampire existence never fully faded despite Emmett's influence. Emmett as strong and cheerful son, whose humor lightened household that tended toward seriousness. Alice as optimistic and social daughter, whose visions and whose friendship made her beloved by everyone. And Jasper as quiet and strategic son, whose empathic ability and whose military background made him family's tactician when problems required planning. The 1990s brought technological revolution that changed how humans communicated and how information was stored and shared. The internet and digital record keeping creating new challenges for vampires whose paper trails needed to be convincing and whose identities needed to withstand scrutiny. That computer databases and that online searches made easier than manual record checking had been in previous decades. Alice's visions helped the family stay ahead of technological changes by showing them what systems were coming and what adaptations they would need to make to maintain their cover. Her foresight allowing them to prepare documentation and to establish digital presence before officials or before curious humans might investigate their backgrounds and might discover inconsistencies that would raise questions. The bonding that occurred across decades of living together created genuine family structure rather than simply creating coven of vampires who shared territory and who cooperated for mutual benefit. They developed inside jokes and shared memories, and the kind of intimacy that comes from knowing each other completely, and from accepting each other's flaws, and from loving each other. Despite the tensions and despite the conflicts that arose periodically, when personalities clashed, or when decisions needed to be made about relocations, or about how to handle situations that affected everyone. The love was real even when perfect harmony was impossible. Their commitment to each other tested and proven through decades of challenges and through decades of choosing to stay together when separation would have been easier, or when individual desires conflicted with family needs. The early 2000s brought discussion about next location as their current residence was approaching the point where departure would become necessary before aging became too obvious to ignore. Alice's visions showed possibility of settling somewhere more permanently than previous locations had allowed. Her glimpses of future suggesting that stability might be achievable if they found right place where conditions supported extended residence and where their cover could be maintained for longer than the usual few years that characterized most of their stays. The family was hopeful, but was cautious, their experience teaching them that plans often changed and that circumstances often forced departures earlier than anticipated when accidents happened or when exposure risk became too great. The decision to move to Forks, Washington in 2003 came from practical considerations about cloud cover, and about isolation, combined with Alice's visions suggesting that this location might offer the stability they had been seeking. The persistent rain and the persistent overcast skies would allow them more freedom of movement during daytime hours without risking exposure through sparkling skin that sunlight would reveal. The small population would mean fewer witnesses and fewer opportunities for their unchanging appearance to be noticed across years, and the proximity to Olympic National Forest would provide excellent hunting territory where animal populations were abundant and where human presence was minimal enough that vampire activities would not be detected or would not be connected to the Cullen family if evidence was discovered. The purchase of large house outside Forks town limits provided privacy and provided space for family whose members valued both togetherness and occasional solitude when living in close quarters with telepathic brother and with empathic brother made true privacy impossible, but when physical separation at least reduced the intensity of constant awareness of each other's presence. The house became home in ways that previous residences had not fully achieved. Esme's renovation work and her decoration creating beauty and creating comfort that made the space feel permanent, even though experience suggested that permanence was illusion and that departure would eventually become necessary. The enrollment at Forks High School and Carlisle's position at Forks Hospital established their cover and established their presence in the community. The initial curiosity about the beautiful new family gradually fading as months passed, and as the Cullens maintained their careful distance and maintained their reputation as private but polite family, whose wealth explained their aloofness and whose good behavior prevented complaints or prevented problems that might have drawn unwanted attention. The expectation was that Forks would be temporary, like everywhere else had been temporary. But something felt different about this place, and something in Alice's visions suggested that their time here might extend beyond the usual few years if circumstances aligned and if fortune favored them in ways it rarely had during their nomadic decades. The move to Forks, Washington in 2003 represented another relocation in the endless series of relocations that characterized Cullen family existence. But the small logging town on the Olympic Peninsula felt different from the beginning in ways that none of them could quite articulate, but that all of them sensed through Alice's visions and through the general atmosphere of possibility that seemed to permeate their first months in the rainiest town in the continental United States. The cloud cover was exceptional and was persistent. The meteorological patterns that brought moisture from the Pacific Ocean, creating near-constant overcast conditions that would allow the family more freedom during daytime hours than they had experienced in sunnier locations, where venturing outside during school hours or during business hours risked exposure if clouds parted unexpectedly and revealed their sparkling skin to witnesses who would ask questions that had no good answers. The town itself was economically depressed and was shrinking. The decline of the timber industry having reduced employment opportunities and having driven younger residents to leave for cities where jobs were more plentiful and where futures seemed brighter than Forks could offer, when its primary industry was dying and when its population was aging without sufficient replacement from new generations, who saw no reason to stay in town that offered little beyond natural beauty and beyond quiet existence that young people generally found boring rather than appealing. The high school was small enough that the Cullen family's arrival created significant disruption to established social hierarchies, their collective beauty and their obvious wealth making them immediate objects of fascination and making them immediate targets of gossip and speculation about who they were and why they had chosen Forks as their new residence, when wealthy families usually preferred more cosmopolitan locations. Carlyle joined the staff at Forks Hospital, where his credentials and his obvious competence made him a valuable addition to medical team that was chronically understaffed and chronically struggling to serve a community whose healthcare needs exceeded available resources. His reputation as skilled and compassionate physician spread quickly through small town, where word of mouth was primary means of communication, and where new doctors' arrival was a noteworthy event that people discussed at length. His night shift preference was accepted without question because hospital needed coverage, and because his willingness to work hours that other doctors avoided made him indispensable despite his unusual schedule that kept him away from daytime activities and that kept him largely invisible to townspeople who were not patients or who were not hospital staff. The enrollment of the 5 teenage Cullens at Forks High School in fall of 2003 created immediate sensation among student body that rarely saw new students and that never saw new students who looked like models and who carried themselves with confidence and with grace that suggested wealth and suggested sophistication far beyond what Forks teenagers typically possessed. Edward and Alice and Jasper enrolled as juniors initially, their supposed ages placing them in 11th grade, where they would spend 2 years before graduating, and where they would need to maintain their performance of being 16 or 17 years old, despite being decades or centuries older than their classmates. Rosalie and Emmett enrolled as seniors, their plan being to graduate after 1 year and then to either leave town or to take gap year before supposedly attending college that would keep them away from Forks High School but would not require them to leave the area if the family decided to extend their residence beyond the usual time frame. The cover story presented to school administrators and to curious students was that Dr. Cullen and his wife had adopted or fostered the 5 teenagers from various difficult situations. The vague explanations satisfying most inquiries without providing details that might create inconsistencies or might invite investigation into backgrounds that would not withstand serious scrutiny. Edward and Alice and Emmett were presented as Cullens, while Rosalie and Jasper were presented as Hales, the different surnames explaining why some siblings had different names and allowing Rosalie and Jasper to pose as biological siblings, while Rosalie's actual relationship with Emmett was presented as recent romance between foster siblings whose connection had developed after joining the household. The reaction from Forks High School students was predictable fascination mixed with intimidation, the Cullen teenagers' beauty and their aloofness creating mystique that made them objects of intense interest and objects of romantic speculation despite their obvious disinterest in forming friendships or forming relationships with humans whose lives would be brief and whose presence in Cullen existence would be temporary when relocation was inevitable and when attachments would create complications. The family sat together at lunch and kept to themselves during classes and maintained polite distance that discouraged attempts at friendship while preventing outright rudeness that might create enemies or might create problems with school administration, that valued good behavior and that appreciated students who caused no trouble. The routine established during the 2003 to 2004 school year was comfortable and was familiar. The performance of being high school students, something all of them had done dozens of times across decades of relocations, and something they could execute without conscious effort. When their roles were well rehearsed, and when their interactions with humans followed scripts they had refined through experience. Edward played piano in the music room during free periods and maintained his reputation as talented but brooding artist whose aloofness was interpreted as depth rather than as vampire's natural separation from human concerns. Alice was friendly and was charming, her social skills making her popular despite her refusal to attend parties or to participate in activities that would require extended contact with humans whose scent would test her control and would test her family's control when they were nearby. Rosalie maintained her Ice Queen persona that discouraged romantic interest through coldness rather than through simple disinterest, her beauty attracting attention, but her demeanor making clear that attention was unwelcome and would not be rewarded. Emmett was outgoing and was humorous, his size making him natural candidate for football team or for other sports that his supernatural abilities would have made unfair if he had participated. His refusal to join teams explained through supposed injuries or through academic commitments that kept him too busy for extracurricular activities. Jasper was quiet and was careful, his empathic gift making him aware of every emotion in crowded hallways and making school environment exhausting when hundreds of teenage feelings bombarded him constantly and required conscious effort to filter and to ignore when their intensity and their volatility were overwhelming. The summer of 2004 brought relief from school routine and brought opportunities for family bonding through hunting trips and through activities that required privacy and required isolation from human observation. The baseball games during thunderstorms became tradition, the thunder covering the sound of bat striking ball and the lightning providing dramatic backdrop for games where supernatural speed and supernatural strength made plays that would be impossible for humans and that would be spectacular if anyone had been watching. The joy they found in these private moments reminded them why family mattered and why staying together was worth the complications and worth the compromises that group living required. When individual desires sometimes conflicted with collective needs, the stability they felt in Forks was unusual and was precious. The combination of suitable environment and of growing comfort with their cover story, creating hope that this residence might extend beyond few years and might become something approaching permanent when Alice's visions continued to show them settled here and continued to show future that did not include immediate relocation or immediate crisis. The family began to invest more in the house and began to invest more in their cover identities, the increased commitment reflecting their shared hope that Forks might be the place where they could finally stop running and could finally stop performing temporary existence in favor of building something that felt more like actual home. The beginning of the 2004 to 2005 school year felt routine and felt unremarkable. The family settling into their second year at Forks High School with same patterns and same careful distance from human classmates who had largely accepted the Cullens' presence and had largely stopped trying to befriend them or to include them in social activities. The expectation was that this year would pass like the previous year had passed. with careful maintenance of cover and with careful avoidance of situations that might risk exposure or might create complications that would force early departure from town that was working well for their purposes. January 18th of 2005 brought Isabella Swan to Forks High School. The police chief Charlie Swan's daughter arriving from Phoenix to live with her father in arrangement that apparently resulted from her mother's remarriage and from complicated family dynamics that the Cullens neither knew about nor cared about, beyond recognizing that new student would temporarily disrupt established social patterns and would create curiosity that might draw attention to the Cullens if the new girl noticed them, or if she became object of intense interest that made everyone more observant and more aware of unusual dynamics within the student body. Bella's appearance was unremarkable by normal human standards. Her brown hair and brown eyes and pale skin creating overall impression of ordinary prettiness that would not have attracted particular attention, except for the fact that she was new and that small schools treated new students as noteworthy events regardless of their actual qualities. Edward's violent reaction to Bella Swan in biology class on her first day was crisis that no one had anticipated, and crisis that threatened everything the family had built in Forks, when his struggle to control his thirst in her presence was visible and was dangerous enough that immediate departure seemed necessary to prevent murder that would destroy their cover and would destroy their family through exposure that Edward's loss of control would create. The scent of her blood was unlike anything Edward had encountered in nearly a century of vampire existence, her particular biological chemistry creating what he described as singing quality that made her irresistible and made resisting the urge to drink from her require every ounce of control he possessed, and require physical restraint that made his hands grip the table edge hard enough to damage the surface. The family meeting that night was tense and was divided. Rosalie advocating strongly for immediate departure before Edward's lack of control created disaster, while Carlyle urged patience and urged faith in Edward's ability to manage his thirst if given time and given support. Edward himself wanted to leave and wanted to flee to Alaska, or to anywhere far from Forks, where Bella Swan's scent would not torment him and would not risk turning him into killer, when century of vegetarian lifestyle had proven that he could maintain control and could maintain his commitment to preserving human life. The compromise was that Edward would leave temporarily for Alaska, while the rest of the family remained in Forks to maintain their cover and to assess whether his return would be possible or whether his reaction to Bella indicated that family would need to relocate permanently. The week Edward spent in Alaska with the Denali Coven allowed him to gain perspective and allowed him to build resolve to return to Forks and to attempt coexistence with the girl whose blood called to him in ways that made rational thought difficult and made vampire instincts nearly overwhelming. Tanya's advice and Carlyle's remote counsel helped him develop strategy for managing his thirst through breathing techniques and through careful distance maintenance that would keep him far enough from Bella that her scent would be diluted by classroom air and by presence of other students whose less appealing scents would provide some buffer against the intensity of her particular appeal. The return to school brought renewed struggle, as Edward attempted to exist in same building and same classroom as Bella, while maintaining control that felt precarious and felt uncertain, when every breath brought her scent, and every moment tested his commitment to vegetarian lifestyle that suddenly seemed inadequate preparation for temptation, this powerful and this specific. But alongside the thirst was fascination that grew from discovery that her mind was silent to his telepathy, her thoughts completely blocked in ways that no human's thoughts had ever been blocked, and in ways that made her mysterious and made her intriguing beyond simple blood appeal, when Edward had never encountered anyone whose inner life was hidden from him. The development of their relationship from March through April of 2005 was watched with concern by family members who worried that Edward's obsession with Bella was dangerous and was risking exposure when his attention to her was obvious and was creating exactly the kind of notice that family had spent decades avoiding. Rosalie was particularly angry about the situation. Her practical concerns about safety combining with her philosophical objections to Edward, risking everything for a human girl who would age and die, while Edward remained frozen at 17 and would eventually need to watch her grow old, or would need to transform her and would need to condemn her to immortality that Rosalie considered curse rather than gift. Alice's visions showed Bella becoming part of their future in ways that suggested she would not remain human indefinitely. The glimpses of Vampire Bella appearing in various scenarios and various timelines that all seemed to converge on eventual transformation that would make her family member rather than keeping her perpetual outsider, whose humanity made her vulnerable and made her temporary. The visions brought both comfort and concern. Comfort because they suggested Edward's relationship with Bella might not end in tragedy and concern, because transformation would mean taking human life and would mean creating new vampire whose adjustment to vegetarian lifestyle could not be guaranteed and whose presence would change family dynamics in ways that decades of stability had not prepared them for. The crisis with James and Victoria and Laurent in late March of 2005 brought the family together in defense of Bella, whose encounter with nomadic vampires during baseball game created immediate danger when Tracker caught her scent and decided to hunt her for sport, and for the challenge that her protection by Cullen Coven represented. The coordination required to protect her and to lead James away from Fawkes demonstrated the family's capabilities and demonstrated their commitment to Edward's choice, even when that choice created risks and created situations that vegetarian vampires normally avoided through staying away from other vampires whose traditional feeding habits and whose traditional approaches to humans made cooperation difficult. The chase to Phoenix and the confrontation at the art ballet studio where James had lured Bella through deception brought the family to edge of disaster when James's attack injured Bella and introduced venom into her bloodstream that Edward had to extract through controlled bite that required him to taste her blood and required him to stop before he drained her completely. The success of Edward's restraint and the success of Carlisle's medical treatment that saved Bella's life created relief, but also created new complications when her knowledge of vampire existence and her continued relationship with Edward meant that family would need to make decisions about her future that would affect everyone and would affect their ability to remain in Fawkes, when Volturi law stated clearly that humans who knew about vampires must either join through transformation or must die to protect the secret. The summer of 2005 brought increasing integration of Bella into family activities and brought increasing acceptance from some family members, while Rosalie's resistance remained firm and remained based on conviction that Bella was making a terrible choice by choosing vampire existence over human life that offered possibilities that immortality would foreclose forever. The fall of 2005 brought the formal vote that would determine Bella's future and would determine whether the family would support her transformation into vampire or whether they would oppose Edward's growing commitment to the human girl whose presence had become constant fixture in their household and whose knowledge of their true nature created ongoing security risk that Volturi law addressed through clear mandate that those who knew must join or must die. The vote was called at Bella's request after she had made clear her intention to become vampire eventually, and after Edward's continued resistance to transforming her had created impasse that required family involvement because Bella's fate affected everyone and because her transformation would change family dynamics in ways that individual decision could not fully account for when collective security and collective future were at stake. Carlyle's perspective on the vote was conflicted between his respect for individual choice and his deep reluctance to take human life through transformation that would end Bella's mortality and would condemn her to immortal existence that she might not fully understand, despite her certainty that she wanted eternity with Edward regardless of what eternity would cost her. His medical ethics and his centuries of preserving life rather than ending it made him uncomfortable with transforming healthy young woman whose human future stretched ahead with possibilities that vampire existence would eliminate. But his recognition that Bella's choice was genuine and was informed by months of exposure to vampire family and to vampire reality made him willing to accept her decision if she maintained her conviction after adequate time for reflection. Esme's vote came from maternal love for Edward and from growing affection for Bella, whose presence brought joy to Edward that Esme had never witnessed during the decades she had known him as perpetually melancholy son, whose loneliness had seemed permanent and had seemed incurable until this human girl had broken through his isolation and had made him happy in ways that transformed his entire demeanor and his entire approach to existence. Her support for Bella's transformation was enthusiastic and was immediate, her desire for Edward's happiness outweighing any concerns about the difficulties that newborn vampire would create or about the risks that transformation always carried when outcome was never completely certain and when adjustment to vampire nature varied widely among individuals. Emmett's vote was practical and was based on simple calculation that Bella as vampire would be safer and would be less vulnerable than Bella as human, whose continued exposure to vampire world created dangers that mortality made severe when accidents or when malicious vampires could end her life easily, while vampire body would provide durability and would provide protection that human flesh could never offer. He liked Bella and enjoyed her presence in family, his easy acceptance of her making him natural ally in discussions about her future, when his uncomplicated nature allowed him to see clearly what others complicated, through excessive analysis or through philosophical objections that Emmett considered less important than straightforward recognition that Bella wanted transformation and that family should support her choice. Rosalie's vote against transformation was passionate and was absolute. Her opposition rooted in her own experience of having choice stolen through transformation without consent and her conviction that Bella was throwing away precious human life for vampire existence, that Rosalie would trade everything to escape if trading were possible, and if human life could be reclaimed through any means. Her monologue to Bella, explaining why she voted no, became one of rare moments of vulnerability that Rosalie allowed herself. The sharing of her human story and her assault and her transformation, designed to make Bella understand what she was choosing and what she would be losing when immortality meant never aging and never having children and never experiencing normal human milestones that gave mortal life meaning and gave mortal existence purpose that vampire existence could never fully replace. Alice's vote was enthusiastic yes delivered with certainty that came from visions showing Bella as beloved sister and as family member, whose presence enriched everyone and whose transformation was inevitable, regardless of when it occurred or who performed it. Her friendship with Bella had developed rapidly into genuine affection that made Alice invested in Bella's happiness and invested in Bella's integration into family structure that Alice considered incomplete without Bella's permanent presence. The visions showing their future together as vampires shopping and traveling and experiencing eternity as sisters made Alice eager for transformation to occur and made her impatient with delays that seemed unnecessary when outcome was already determined by decisions that had been made or would be made regardless of current hesitations. Jasper's vote was reluctant yes, based on practical security considerations rather than based on personal preference. His acknowledgement that Bella's knowledge created ongoing vulnerability, that transformation would resolve making him support her eventual change, despite his awareness that his own struggles with control would be complicated by a newborn vampire whose thirst would be intense and whose presence would amplify temptation through empathic connection that made him feel others' desires as additions to his own barely managed thirst. His abstention was possible, but seemed cowardly when family vote required courage to state position clearly and required willingness to accept responsibility for an outcome regardless of personal discomfort with the process. Edward's refusal to transform Bella himself and his continued attempts to convince her to choose human life created ongoing tension within family and created ongoing conflict between Edward and Bella, whose determination to become vampire was strengthened rather than weakened by his resistance and by his arguments that she should marry human man and should have children and should grow old naturally, rather than freezing at 18 and spending eternity as vampire whose existence would be defined by what she had sacrificed, rather than by what she had gained. His position was that transformation should only occur if Bella's human life was ending through injury or through illness, his unwillingness to take her mortality when she was healthy and young, making him insist that someone else perform transformation if it must occur, or that circumstances must force the choice, rather than allowing it to be an elective decision made from desire rather than made from necessity. The engagement that Edward proposed in spring of 2006 represented compromise between his desire for Bella to experience human marriage and her desire to become vampire as soon as possible. His condition that she marry him before transformation, creating bargain that both found acceptable, even though their reasons for accepting were completely different and were rooted in completely different value systems. Edward valued human traditions and valued the idea that Bella should have wedding, and should have the experience of being human bride before vampire transformation eliminated that possibility, while Bella accepted marriage as price for transformation that Edward would perform after wedding had occurred and after his conditions had been met. The wedding planning became Alice's domain and became Alice's joy, her vision for perfect ceremony and perfect celebration, driving preparations that were elaborate and were expensive and were designed to create memories that would last beyond human lifespan and would mark the transition from Bella's mortality to Bella's immortality through an event that honored both states and that celebrated love that had brought them to this point. Esme participated enthusiastically in planning and in preparations. Her maternal pleasure in Edward's happiness and in Bella's integration into family making wedding feel like personal victory and like confirmation that family she and Carlisle had built was complete and was successful in ways that transcended simple survival or simple coexistence. Rosalie's participation in wedding preparations was minimal and was reluctant, her continued opposition to Bella's choice making her unable to celebrate an event that she viewed as step toward mistake that could not be undone, and that would condemn Bella to existence that Rosalie considered curse, despite everyone else's acceptance or enthusiasm. The distance she maintained was not personal attack on Bella, but was self-protection against the pain of watching another person choose what Rosalie had never chosen, and choose what Rosalie would give everything to undo if undoing were possible through any means or through any sacrifice. The wedding on the 13th of August in 2006 was beautiful in ways that Alice's vision and Esme's execution had ensured. The Cullen house and grounds transformed into a setting that honored both human traditions and vampire aesthetics through combination of elegance and natural beauty that created atmosphere worthy of the commitment being celebrated and worthy of the transformation that would follow after honeymoon had provided brief period of human experience before vampire existence began. The Denali cousins attended as extended family, their presence adding to celebration and adding to sense that this wedding marked important moment not just for Edward and Bella, but for vegetarian vampire community that was small and that valued connections between covens who shared values and who shared commitment to preserving human life. Charlie Swan's presence as father of bride brought human element into otherwise vampire celebration. His pride in his daughter and his nervousness about her marriage to young man he barely knew, creating poignant contrast with vampire family's complete confidence in Edward's devotion and in relationships' permanence, when immortality would guarantee that till death do us part meant forever, rather than meaning few human decades. The reception allowed family and friends to celebrate together, the dancing and the toasts and the joy marking Edward's transformation from solitary melancholy figure into complete person, whose happiness was evident and was transformative for everyone who had watched him suffer through decades of loneliness. The honeymoon to Ile Esme off the coast of Brazil provided privacy and provided opportunity for Edward and Bella to experience physical intimacy that Edward had resisted during their human courtship, out of fear that his vampire strength would injure her or would kill her accidentally. When passion made control difficult, and when newlywed enthusiasm might override caution that had kept them apart despite mutual desire, that Edward's century of self-control had barely managed to contain. The island was Carlisle's gift to Esme decades earlier and was now offered to Edward and Bella as honeymoon destination, where isolation would protect them from observation and would allow them freedom that populated areas could never provide when vampire nature made normal honeymoon activities complicated or impossible. The phone call from Edward in late August brought news that nobody had anticipated and that nobody had believed was possible. His panicked explanation that Bella was sick and was returning early, creating immediate alarm within family that knew vampire mates did not get sick, and that knew human sicknesses should not affect Bella in ways that would require cutting short honeymoon and would require immediate return to Forks. The confusion turned to shock when Edward finally explained over the phone that Bella was pregnant. The biological impossibility of vampire-human hybrid pregnancy creating crisis that no one had prepared for and creating situation that vampire lore had never documented, and that Carlisle's extensive knowledge could not explain or predict. Bella's appearance when they arrived at Cullen House shocked everyone who saw her. The 2 weeks since wedding having transformed healthy young bride into emaciated figure whose body was clearly being consumed from within by something that was growing faster than human gestation timeline would allow, and that was creating damage that was visible in her pallor and in her obvious pain and in the physical changes that suggested advanced pregnancy, despite impossibly short time frame. Carlisle's examination confirmed the pregnancy and confirmed that fetus was growing at accelerated rate that exceeded human development by significant margin, the hybrid nature creating something that was part vampire and part human, and entirely unprecedented in vampire history that Carlisle knew from his centuries of study and from his extensive reading of vampire texts and traditions. The family's immediate division over what to do about the pregnancy revealed fundamental disagreements about life and about choice, and about whether fetus constituted baby-deserving protection or constituted threat that was killing Bella and that needed to be removed before it could complete the destruction of her human body that was clearly inadequate to sustain hybrid pregnancy without catastrophic damage. Edward's position was unambiguous and was desperate. His demand that fetus be aborted immediately coming from terror that Bella would die and from conviction that nothing was worth losing her when he had finally found her and had finally convinced her to marry him and to choose future with him. That pregnancy was now threatening to destroy. Carlisle was torn between his respect for all life, including fetal life, and his concern for Bella's survival. His medical training telling him that pregnancy was not viable in conventional sense, and that Bella's body could not sustain it without dying, but his philosophical commitments making him reluctant to end potential life without exploring alternatives, or without confirming that death was truly inevitable. Esme supported whatever decision Bella made, while hoping desperately that Bella would choose abortion that would save her life and would preserve Edward's happiness that Esme valued above almost everything else, including the hybrid whose existence was creating this crisis. Rosalie's instant and fierce protection of unborn babies surprised everyone, including herself. The intensity of her response coming from depths she had not fully recognized and coming from maternal longings that decades of childless existence had created and had amplified until opportunity to finally experience motherhood, even vicariously, was too powerful to resist regardless of risks or regardless of opposition from family members who wanted abortion. Her alliance with Bella in protecting pregnancy created unprecedented partnership between two women who had been adversaries. Their shared commitment to preserving fetal life, overriding previous conflicts, and creating bond based on mutual determination that baby deserved chance to live regardless of danger and regardless of medical opinions, suggesting pregnancy was unsurvivable. The pregnancy weeks from late August through early September were characterized by Bella's rapid deterioration and by families' desperate attempts to keep her alive long enough to deliver baby whose survival was uncertain and whose nature was completely unknown. When no one had ever encountered hybrid vampire human before, and when medical literature provided no guidance about how to manage pregnancy that violated every known biological principle. Rosalie became Bella's constant companion and protector, her vampire strength making her capable of defending Bella from family members who might try to force medical intervention, and her dedication to baby making her willing to sacrifice Bella's life if necessary to give child chance at existence. The discovery that Bella could consume blood when human food was rejected by her body provided partial solution to nutritional crisis. The vampire approach to pregnancy complications, creating bizarre situation where human was drinking blood to feed hybrid fetus whose needs were incompatible with normal human diet. Rosalie's preparation for baby's arrival included nursery setup and shopping and all material provisions, despite uncertainty about whether baby would survive birth or whether Bella would survive delivery when injuries were accumulating and when internal damage was approaching levels that would be fatal without transformation. To preserve whatever remained of Bella's human body after birth, extracted baby from womb that could barely contain it. The birth, on September 10th, came suddenly and came violently, when baby's movements became too forceful, and when Bella's body finally reached absolute limit of what it could endure, her spine breaking and her placenta rupturing, creating emergency that required immediate delivery through whatever means necessary to extract baby before Bella died from injuries and blood loss that were already approaching fatal levels. The delivery room scene was chaos of blood and panic as Carlisle and Edward worked frantically to save both mother and child, while Rosalie assisted until massive blood loss overwhelmed her control and forced her removal from room before she could attack Bella and could destroy everything through moment of weakness that decades of discipline had not prepared her for, when human blood in such quantities was more than newborn vampire instincts could resist. Renesmee's birth alive and apparently healthy brought relief that was immediately complicated by question of whether Bella would survive transformation that Edward initiated through desperate venom injection directly into her heart, while Jacob performed CPR to keep her alive during crucial moments when her heart was stopping. The 3 days of Bella's transformation brought entire family into waiting mode as they cared for rapidly growing Renesmee and hoped that venom would take hold and would repair Bella's broken body before death could claim her and could destroy Edward, whose grief would be absolute if his choices had killed the woman he loved more than his own existence. Bella's awakening as vampire brought exceptional control that surprised everyone who expected newborn bloodlust and expected dangerous adjustment period. Her shield ability apparently protecting her from normal newborn struggles and allowing her to meet her daughter immediately rather than requiring separation that would have been necessary if her control had been typical. the family complete with 8 members, including a hybrid child, whose rapid growth and whose unusual abilities would create new challenges, but would also create new joy and new purpose that decades of static existence had not provided when change and growth were impossible for vampires whose bodies never changed and whose lives never progressed beyond repetition of same patterns across endless centuries. The aftermath of Volturi confrontation in early January of 2007 brought settling that felt different from previous settlings that had characterized the family's nomadic existence across decades of relocations and decades of temporary residences that had never quite achieved the permanence that Forks was beginning to represent. The witnesses who had gathered from around the world to testify about Renesmee's nature and to stand with the Cullens against Volturi threat dispersed gradually over the following weeks. They returned to respective territories, marking end of crisis and marking beginning of new phase, where family could live without immediate existential danger hanging over their existence and without constant fear that ancient vampire authorities would return to destroy them for violations they had not committed or for threats they did not pose. The family's integration of Renesmee into their daily existence transformed household dynamics in ways that decades of static vampire relationships had not prepared them for, but that they adapted to with surprising ease when maternal instincts and when protective instincts and when simple love for extraordinary child created new patterns and created new purposes that made immortal existence feel less repetitive and feel less empty than it had felt during centuries when change was impossible and when growth was limited to accumulation of knowledge rather than accumulation of experience that actually altered who they were or how they related to each other. Rosalie's role as Renesmee's primary caregiver, alongside Bella, created partnership between 2 women whose previous antagonism had been replaced by shared devotion to child, who needed both of them and who benefited from having multiple mothers whose different perspectives and whose different strengths provided comprehensive care that single parent could not have provided. The shared motherhood arrangement that developed organically allowed both women to express maternal love while respecting boundaries and while acknowledging that Bella was biological mother and primary parent, while Rosalie was beloved aunt and secondary caregiver, whose involvement was welcomed rather than resented. When Bella recognized that Rosalie's love for Renesmee was genuine and was beneficial, rather than being threat to Bella's own maternal bond. Edward's acceptance of Rosalie's deep involvement in his daughter's life represented growth and represented healing of conflicts that had divided them for decades. His recognition that Rosalie's transformation during pregnancy crisis had been motivated by love rather than by manipulation, allowing him to forgive past antagonism and allowing him to appreciate her devotion to Renesmee, whose happiness was enhanced by having extended family who all adored her. Jacob Black's continued presence as imprinted werewolf created unusual dynamic that required ongoing negotiation and required ongoing tolerance from vampires who had centuries of enmity with shapeshifters built into their instincts and built into their cultural understanding of natural enemies, whose very existence triggered hostility and triggered territorial responses that peaceful coexistence required conscious effort to suppress. The imprint bond made Jacob devoted protector, whose commitment to Renesmee was absolute and was involuntary. his role in her life shifting to match her developmental needs rather than being fixed as romantic interests that his age and that circumstances made inappropriate when she was infant, and when his devotion was more like devoted older brother than like future partner. Rosalie's gradual acceptance of Jacob's presence came from recognition that his protection benefited Renesmee, and that his devotion was genuine even if his werewolf nature made him fundamentally incompatible with vampire family, whose existence he had spent years opposing before Imprint had created alliance that transcended species hatred and that transcended personal preferences. The alliance between Rosalie and Jacob developed through their shared commitment to Renemee's safety and through their mutual recognition that cooperation served her better than conflict would serve her when she needed both vampire family and imprinted protector to provide complete support system that her unique hybrid nature required. Renemee's rapid growth during her first years brought wonder and brought anxiety as family watched her develop from newborn to apparent toddler within weeks and watched her progress from toddler to apparent preschooler within months, each stage bringing new abilities and bringing new challenges that required adaptation and required learning when no guidebooks existed for raising a hybrid child whose developmental timeline was unprecedented and whose needs were unique. Her vampire strength required teaching control so she would not accidentally harm humans or accidentally reveal her nature through displays of supernatural ability, while her human warmth and her human heartbeat required protection from cold and required attention to environmental factors that full vampires did not need to consider when their bodies were impervious to temperature and were impervious to most physical discomforts. The heartbeat that Renesmee possessed was source of constant fascination for family members who had not heard their own heartbeat since transformations had stopped their hearts and had made their bodies run on venom rather than on blood. The sound of her heart beating and the warmth of her skin created sensory experiences that connected them to mortal world in ways that purely vampire existence had not allowed. The reminder of humanity present in their household through child, who was half human and who carried within her the life that vampires had lost when transformation had killed their human biology and had replaced it with immortal structure that never changed and never aged. The reflection on what each family member had gained through joining the Olympic Coven brought recognition that their individual traumas and their individual losses had been transformed into collective strength and into collective purpose that made existence bearable and made immortality feel like gift rather than feeling like curse when shared with people who understood and who cared and who committed to each other across decades and across centuries of choosing to remain together, despite difficulties and despite conflicts that arose periodically when different personalities and different values created friction. Carlyle's vision of compassionate vampire existence had been realized through family of 7 vampires plus 1 hybrid child, whose presence completed what he had been building since his own transformation in 1660s. London had set him on path toward creating alternative to traditional vampire society that valued power over compassion and that valued strength over morality. His centuries of loneliness had been transformed into patriarchal role that gave him purpose and that gave him family whose love and whose respect validated his choices and validated his conviction that vampires could choose goodness despite their predatory nature and despite the ease with which they could destroy rather than preserve the human lives that surrounded them. Esme's transformation from suicidal despair after losing her baby to becoming heart of loving home demonstrated that even the deepest losses could find unexpected healing when new purposes and when new loves replaced what had been lost and created meaning that previous existence had lacked. Her passionate capacity for love had found outlet in family whose members she cherished as children, regardless of their actual ages or their actual relationships to her. Her maternal nature providing emotional foundation that held family together during crises and during conflicts, when her steadiness and her unconditional acceptance created safe space for everyone to be themselves, without fear of rejection or without fear of judgment. Edward's journey from brooding loneliness to complete love as both husband and father represented transformation that century of vampire existence had not achieved, but that meeting Bella had catalyzed and that Renesmee had completed, when fatherhood gave him new dimension of purpose, a new dimension of joy that romantic love alone had not fully provided. His telepathy that had been curse-making romantic connections seem impossible had become gift that allowed him to understand his family deeply and that allowed him to protect them through awareness of thoughts and through awareness of intentions that normal observation would miss. Rosalie's path from bitter resentment of immortality to fulfilled motherhood showed that vicarious experiences could provide genuine satisfaction and could heal wounds that direct experiences would never heal when circumstances made direct fulfillment impossible. Her motherhood was not conventional and was not biological, but her love for Renesmee was as real and was as powerful as any biological mother's love would have been. The bond between them proving that family was created through choice and through devotion rather than being created solely through blood or through genetic connection, that traditional definitions of motherhood emphasized. Emmett's transformation from mountain death to joyful immortality demonstrated that vampire nature could be accepted and could be embraced when perspective allowed focus on gains rather than focus on losses, and when partnership with someone who needed joy provided motivation to maintain optimism despite difficulties. His strength was physical and was obvious, but his emotional strength and his ability to find humor and to find pleasure in existence that others found burdensome made him essential to family dynamics that might otherwise have become too serious or too focused on suffering and on sacrifice that vegetarian lifestyle required. Alice's journey from asylum patient with no past to beloved sister with bright future showed that identity could be created rather than remembered, and that past trauma could be overcome through focus on future possibilities rather than through focus on historical wounds that could not be healed because they could not be remembered. Her visions provided practical guidance that kept family safe, but her optimism and her friendship provided emotional sustenance that was equally valuable. When immortal existence required hope and required belief that future would bring joy rather than bringing only repetition of present circumstances. Jasper's transformation from blood-soaked warrior to peaceful family man demonstrated that even the most violent past could be redeemed through commitment to different values and through acceptance of discipline that vegetarian lifestyle required when every moment presented temptation and when empathic gift meant feeling collective thirst that amplified personal struggle. His continued difficulty with control was accepted without judgment and without shame. the family recognizing that his path was harder than their paths had been, and that his progress was genuine even when setbacks occurred, and even when perfection remained elusive. The family dynamics that had settled into stable patterns after voluntary confrontation reflected years of learning each other and years of accommodating differences, while maintaining commitment to shared values and to shared goals that made them family, rather than making them simply coven of vampires who cooperated for mutual benefit. The love was real and was deep. The bonds between them tested through crises and proven through choices to support each other and to sacrifice for each other. When individual desires conflicted with collective needs, or when protecting one member required risks or required efforts from everyone. Renee's continued growth toward maturity point where her development would stabilize brought bittersweet recognition that childhood phase was temporary and was brief, but the compensation was that her maturation meant she would not remain vulnerable infant or vulnerable child forever, but would achieve adult capabilities while retaining the warmth and the humanity that made her unique among vampires, whose coldness and whose hardness were defining characteristics. The projection was that she would reach a parent age of approximately 7 years, or perhaps slightly older, before growth stopped, and before she achieved whatever equilibrium point her hybrid biology determined was appropriate for someone who was half immortal and half mortal and entirely unprecedented. Jacob's role in her future remained uncertain, and remained subject to speculation about whether imprint would evolve into romantic bond, or whether it would remain fraternal protection, when Renesmee's choices would ultimately determine the nature of their relationship, regardless of what imprint predisposed, or what Jacob hoped, or what family members expected. The imprint guaranteed his devotion, but did not guarantee her reciprocation. The bond one-sided in its compulsion, even though it was bilateral in its effects when Renesmee benefited from his protection and when his presence in her life was valued by her, even if romantic feelings never developed beyond the friendship and the familial affection that characterized their current dynamic. The Forks residence that had begun as temporary location had transformed into permanent home in ways that previous locations had never achieved. The combination of suitable environment and of events that had rooted them here, creating attachment that made departure unthinkable when Renesmee's presence required stability, and when family had invested too much in building life here to abandon it for nomadic existence that had characterized their previous decades. The high school performances would continue for years as family members cycled through graduation and re-enrollment in patterns that would allow them to maintain cover while remaining an area that provided everything they needed and that had become genuinely home rather than becoming merely temporary shelter. The Denali relationship as extended family provided connection to wider vegetarian vampire community and provided reminder that Olympic Coven was not alone in choosing compassion over cruelty, even though they were rare and were unusual in vampire world, that valued strength over morality, and that mocked dietary choices that seemed weak or seemed unnecessarily restrictive when human blood was available and was superior in satisfaction and in nutritional value. The visits between Alaska and Washington would continue across years, the families maintaining bonds that enriched both groups and that provided support network that isolated vegetarian vampires desperately needed when traditional vampire society offered no fellowship and offered no understanding for those who chose different paths. The contemplation of immortality's meaning when shared with family brought recognition that curse could become gift, and that eternal existence could have purpose when love provided motivation and when relationships provided joy that made centuries pass quickly rather than pass slowly, when loneliness or when isolation made time feel oppressive and made existence feel like punishment. The Olympic Coven had become proof that vampires could choose goodness and could choose family and could create lives worth living despite the monstrous nature and despite the predatory instincts that transformation had given them alongside immortality and alongside supernatural abilities that could be used for destruction or could be used for protection, depending on choices that each vampire made about who they wanted to be. The future stretched ahead infinitely without end, and without the comfort of death that mortals could rely on to provide conclusion and to provide escape when existence became unbearable. But the family faced that future together with confidence that togetherness would make eternity bearable and would make immortality feel like blessing, rather than feeling like curse when love and when purpose transformed endless time from prison into possibility and transformed forever from threat into promise that they would never be alone and would never lack meaning as long as they chose to remain together and to remain committed to the values and to the bonds that had created family from fragments of broken lives. So rest now, Twilight souls, knowing that even immortality can be transformed through love and through choice, and through the radical commitment to preserve life rather than to destroy it. The Olympic Coven stands as testament that family is created through devotion rather than through blood, that redemption is possible even after centuries of darkness, and that forever becomes bearable when shared with those who understand and who care and who choose to stay despite the difficulties and despite the endless repetition that immortal existence requires. Let their story carry you gently into sleep with the knowledge that connection heals, that purpose sustains, and that love makes even eternity worth living when you're not facing it alone. Good night.